My husband of 12 years drained our joint savings account while I was presenting to my company's board of directors, transferring every penny to the woman he'd been secretly seeing for months. When I confronted them at their celebration dinner, they laughed in my face until I revealed whose signature was on the loan documents financing his new business venture, and their champagne glasses froze mid-air as they realized the true cost of their betrayal. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed. Because tomorrow, I've saved something extra special for you. The prestigious conference room on the 38th floor offered a panoramic view of the city skyline, glass and steel glittering in the late afternoon sun. Executives in tailored suits sat around the polished mahogany table, their expressions a careful blend of interest and assessment as I navigated through my presentation slides. As Chief Financial Officer, this quarterly board meeting was my moment to showcase not just the company's financial health, but my own value to the organization. And as you can see from these projections, I said, gesturing to the chart displaying an upward trajectory. Our risk mitigation strategy has positioned us to weather market fluctuations while maintaining a growth pattern that outperforms industry averages by 17%. The board chairman, Walter Reynolds, nodded approvingly. I had spent weeks preparing for this presentation, meticulously analyzing data, anticipating questions, rehearsing responses. My husband, Nathan, had barely noticed my late nights and early mornings. But that wasn't unusual lately. Our marriage had cooled over the past year, two ambitious professionals gradually drifting into parallel lives within the same elegant townhouse. "Impressive work, Alexandra," Walter commented. "The restructuring of our Asian investments appears particularly strategic given current market conditions." I felt a familiar sense of professional satisfaction, the quiet confidence that came from navigating complex financial landscapes with precision. At 42, I had built a reputation for fiscal prudence paired with calculated risk, a balance that had served both my career and personal finances well. My phone vibrated silently in the pocket of my blazer. Once, then again in quick succession. I ignored it. Whatever it was could wait. Nothing was more important than maintaining my focus during these crucial 90 minutes with the people who determined my professional future. Thank you, Walter. If we move to the next slide, I'll walk you through our liquidity positions and another vibration, then another. Something about the persistence sent a whisper of concern through my concentration. Board protocol strictly prohibited checking personal devices during meetings, but when my phone began vibrating continuously, the subtle weight of worry grew heavier. "Excuse me for just a moment," I said, maintaining my professional smile as I discreetly checked the screen. 6 missed calls from my bank, 3 text messages flagging unusual account activity, 1 voicemail. A cold sensation spread through my chest as I quickly scanned the text notifications. "Unusual activity detected in your account, ending in 4872. Multiple large transfers totaling $267,894.32. Our joint savings account. Nearly everything we had accumulated together over 12 years of marriage, the house down payment fund, our emergency reserves, the investment seed money we'd been accumulating. Alexandra? Is everything all right?" Walter's voice seemed to come from a great distance. I looked up, suddenly aware that every board member was watching me, their expressions ranging from concern to mild irritation at the interruption. "Yes. I apologize," I managed, slipping the phone back into my pocket. "Where were we?" "Ah, liquidity positions." Somehow, I completed the presentation. Somehow, I answered their questions with coherent responses, maintained my professional composure, and concluded the meeting with appropriate pleasantries. All while the knowledge that something catastrophic was happening to my financial life pulsed beneath the surface of my carefully constructed professional facade. When the boardroom finally emptied, I sank into the nearest chair and called the bank. "Mrs. Harrington, we've been trying to reach you," the account manager said, her voice carefully neutral. There have been several large transfers from your joint savings account today, all authorized using the correct credentials and security verification. What transfers? I didn't authorize anything. The transfers were initiated by the joint account holder, Mr. Nathan Harrington. Since it's a joint account with equal access privileges, the transactions were processed according to standard protocol. My hand tightened around the phone. How much is left in the account? A pause. The current balance is $840.17. The room seemed to tilt slightly. Over $250,000 gone in an afternoon. 12 years of careful saving, of measured financial decisions, of planning. For our future. Can you tell me where the money went? The funds were transferred to an account at First Capital Bank, she replied. The name on the receiving account is Melanie Westbrook. The name struck me like a physical blow. Melanie Westbrook. Nathan's new marketing director, hired 6 months ago. 15 years younger than me, with an effortless beauty that made me, suddenly, painfully aware of my sensible haircut and the fine lines that had begun to appear around my eyes. I had met her exactly twice, once at the company Christmas party, and again when I'd surprised Nathan with lunch at his office last month. Both times he had been oddly distant afterward, picking small arguments over nothing. Mrs. Harrington? Would you like me to initiate fraud proceedings? The question hung in the air. Was this fraud? Legally, perhaps not. Nathan had every right to access our joint account, but to transfer everything without discussion, without warning? No, I said finally. Not yet. Thank you for the information. I ended the call and sat motionless, staring out at the city spreading below me, the lives of millions flowing in their ordinary patterns while mine had just imploded. My phone chimed with an incoming text message. Nathan, won't be home tonight. Having dinner with the team to celebrate our new venture. Don't wait up. New venture. The pieces clicked into terrible alignment. Nathan had been talking about leaving his marketing director position to start his own agency for years, but we had agreed to wait until we had sufficient capital cushion. Apparently, he had decided that day was today, with my money and his new marketing director. I Googled Melanie Westbrook. Her LinkedIn profile appeared first. Marketing director at Carson Media, previously with top agencies in New York and Chicago. Her profile picture showed a woman with shining chestnut hair and confident smile, the kind of effortless poise that seemed to belong on magazine covers. Further down the search results, a recent local business news article. New boutique agency launches with major client acquisition. The article was dated today. It featured a photo of Nathan and Melanie standing proudly in front of an exposed brick wall with a sleek sign, Westbrook and Harrington Creative. The venture Nathan had been dreaming of for years was now reality, funded by our joint savings, bearing her name first, launched without so much as a conversation with his wife of 12 years. I sat in the empty boardroom, my successful presentation now a distant memory as I tried to process this seismic shift in my life. Everything we had built together, our financial security, our plans, our trust, had been transferred away while I stood explaining liquidity positions and risk management to a room full of executives. The irony wasn't lost on me. My phone rang. Again, my assistant, reminding me about my next meeting. Somehow, impossibly, the business of the day was continuing as if my personal life hadn't just collapsed. I gathered my presentation materials, straightened my blazer, and walked out of the boardroom with my head high, already formulating what would happen next. Because if there was one thing I understood perfectly as a chief financial officer, it was this. Every financial decision has consequences, and Nathan was about to discover exactly what those would be. 2 days passed in a blur of professional obligations and private devastation. I maintained my carefully constructed facade at work, the efficient, unflappable CFO whose personal life never interfered with shareholder value. But at night, alone, in our townhouse, I alternated between stunned disbelief and cold, calculated planning. Nathan hadn't returned home. No calls, no messages beyond that single text about his new venture. Just silence and the echoing emptiness of betrayal. I had considered changing the locks, but something told me he wouldn't be coming back for his clothes or books or the framed photographs that now felt like artifacts from someone else's life. The invitation arrived via email on the third day, its casual tone a calculated insult. Alexandra, Westbrook and Harrington Creative is hosting a launch party this Friday at the Metropolitan downtown. As someone who's been part of my journey, I thought you might want to see what we've built. Feel free to bring a guest. Nathan, part of my journey. As if our 12-year marriage had been a stepping stone, a chapter he'd completed before moving on to more exciting narratives. I read the message 3 times, noting the careful wording, the use of I instead of we, the presumptuous inclusion of his name in the agency title, the implication that I should celebrate his success rather than recognize his theft. I clicked, accept, without hesitation. The Metropolitan was one of the city's premier event spaces, occupying the top floor of a renovated historic bank building downtown. Floor-to-ceiling windows offered panoramic views of the skyline, the same skyline I'd gazed at from my boardroom while Nathan had drained our accounts. The irony wasn't lost on me as I stepped off the elevator into a space transformed by strategic lighting, minimalist floral arrangements, and the distinctive branding of Westbrook and Harrington Creative. Name, please? A young woman with a tablet stood at a sleek reception desk. Alexandra Harrington. Her eyes widened slightly. Recognition? Discomfort? Perhaps both. Of course, Mrs. Harrington. Welcome. I wore a black dress I'd purchased for a charity gala last year. Fitted, elegant, professional. My hair was swept into a precise updo, my makeup flawless. The diamond earrings Nathan had given me for our 10th anniversary completed the ensemble. A small touch of calculated irony. The room was already filled with clients, potential clients, and the creative community that formed the backbone of the city's marketing industry. I recognized faces from Nathan's previous firm, from industry events, from the photographs that occasionally accompanied the business articles I read. And there, in the center of it all, Nathan and Melanie, holding court like royalty at their coronation. She wore a burgundy dress that highlighted her youth and vitality, her chestnut hair falling in artful waves around shoulders left bare by the dress's cut. Nathan stood close beside her, his hand resting possessively at the small of her back, his face animated in a way I hadn't seen in years. They laughed together at something a silver-haired man in an expensive suit had said, their body language speaking volumes about their connection. I accepted a glass of champagne from a passing server and moved through the crowd with practiced ease, exchanging pleasantries with those who recognized me, introducing myself to those who didn't. The CFO mask served me well here, poised, professional, unthreatening. All while I observed the room, noted the clients, estimated the investment that had gone into this launch event, my money, my savings, my future, repurposed without consent. Eventually, inevitably, our paths converged. Alexandra. Nathan's voice carried a note of surprise despite the invitation he'd sent. You came. I turned to face my husband of 12 years, the man I'd built a life with, the man who'd betrayed me while I presented financial projections to my board. I did, I replied, my voice steady. Congratulations on your new venture. Melanie stepped forward, her smile practiced and perfect. We're so glad you could make it. Nathan thought it was important to maintain connections, even as we all move forward. The calculated civility in her tone made it clear she knew exactly who I was, what her role had been in the dissolution of my marriage, and that she felt not the slightest remorse. Maintaining connections is important, I agreed, taking a deliberate sip of champagne. Especially professional ones. Nathan's smile tightened fractionally. The launch has exceeded our expectations. We've already signed 3 major clients and have meetings scheduled with 2 more next week. Impressive, I said. The Metropolitan was an interesting choice for the event. Wasn't this space out of your budget when we discussed potential venues for the Harrington Foundation fundraiser last year? The barb struck home. Nathan's expression flickered briefly, remembering the conversation where he'd deemed this very venue overpriced and pretentious. Now here he stood, hosting his launch party in the space he'd once criticized. Priorities change, he replied, his tone cooler than before. Melanie has exceptional vision for creating the right impression with potential clients. Clearly, I said, allowing my gaze to move between them. Vision is essential in business, as is careful financial planning. Melanie's perfect smile remained fixed, but something shifted in her eyes. A wariness, perhaps, as she recognized the subtext in my words. Nathan tells me you're the CFO at Meridian Global, she said, steering the conversation to safer ground. That must be challenging with all the market volatility lately. Managing financial risk is my specialty, I replied. I've always believed in protecting assets through careful strategic planning. Nathan took a sip of his champagne, his discomfort becoming more evident. Alexandra has always been the cautious one, he told Melanie, his tone suggesting this was a character flaw rather than a professional strength. Sometimes too cautious. Caution has its place, I countered, as does due diligence. A silver-haired man approached our small group, saving Nathan from responding. Nathan there. You are! The Westbrook and Harrington presentation boards are brilliant. Exactly the fresh approach we've been looking for. Robert, thank you, Nathan replied, visibly relieved by the interruption. Have you met my... He hesitated fractionally. Alexandra Harrington. Not my wife. Not even my soon-to-be ex-wife. Just Alexandra Harrington, a person with no defined relationship to him. Alexandra, this is Robert Caldwell, CEO of Caldwell Industries. I extended my hand. A pleasure, Mr. Caldwell. I believe our companies have crossed paths in the financial sector. Indeed they have, Robert replied, recognition dawning. You're the CFO at Meridian, aren't you? Your reputation precedes you. You're too kind, I said. Not at all. Your handling of the Westlake acquisition was masterful. The financing structure your team created is being studied in business schools now. I felt rather than saw Nathan stiffen beside me. The Westlake deal had been my career-defining achievement, a complex acquisition that had nearly doubled Meridian's market share while minimizing debt exposure. The same achievement Nathan had dismissed as just moving money around on paper when I'd been celebrated in the industry press. Financial structures are like foundations, I replied, invisible to most but essential to stability and growth. Melanie slipped her arm through Nathan's, a proprietary gesture that spoke volumes. Nathan has been telling me about your financial expertise. It's why we've been so careful with our business planning for Westbrook and Harrington. I'm sure, I said, allowing my gaze to meet hers directly. Careful planning is essential when launching a new venture, especially regarding funding. Sources. The slight narrowing of her eyes told me she understood the implication. Nathan's fingers tightened around his champagne flute, the only visible sign of his discomfort. Speaking of business planning, Robert interjected, oblivious to the undercurrents. The capital structure you've established for the agency is impressive for a startup. Most creative agencies begin on a shoestring, but you've clearly secured significant investment. We believe in starting strong, Nathan replied, his confidence returning as he addressed a topic he had prepared for. Too many agencies fail because they lack sufficient operating capital in the crucial first year. Wise approach, Robert nodded, though I imagine it required considerable personal investment. The best investments are those you believe in completely, Nathan said, his arm slipping around Melanie's waist. Wouldn't you agree, Alexandra? The challenge in his eyes was unmistakable. A dare to publicly acknowledge what he'd done, to reveal the source of his considerable personal investment, and thereby expose myself as the wronged wife, the emotional casualty in their professional triumph. Instead, I smiled. Absolutely. I've always believed in investing in what you truly own. Something in my tone must have registered, because Nathan's expression shifted slightly, a flicker of uncertainty crossing his features. Before he could respond, a tall woman in an impeccably tailored suit approached our group. Nathan, Melanie, the Donovan representatives have arrived. They're eager to see the mock-ups for their campaign. Of course, Melanie replied smoothly. Alexandra, it was lovely meeting you properly. Please enjoy the party. I'm sure I will, I said, raising my glass slightly. It's fascinating to see what's been accomplished in such a short time. As they moved away through the crowd, I caught Robert Caldwell studying me with a thoughtful expression. Brave of you to attend, he said quietly. Office romances can create such complicated situations when they end professional partnerships. So that was the narrative Nathan had constructed, that he and I had been colleagues whose relationship had run its course, not husband and wife whose marriage had been destroyed by betrayal and theft. Life is full of complications, Mr. Caldwell, I replied. The key is understanding the fine print before signing any agreement. I circulated through the party with practiced ease, exchanging pleasantries and business cards, maintaining the facade of the supportive ex-partner rather than the betrayed wife. Years of navigating corporate politics had prepared me well for this moment. This careful balance of professional courtesy and strategic positioning. With each conversation, I gathered information, building a clearer picture of Nathan and Melanie's new venture, its client base, and its financial foundation. The space itself spoke volumes about their ambitions and their spending. Crystal chandeliers illuminated custom furniture arrangements designed to showcase portfolio pieces displayed on mounted screens. A string quartet played in one corner, their classical renditions of contemporary songs providing a sophisticated soundtrack. Servers circulated with trays of champagne and canapés that I recognized from the city's most exclusive caterer. No expense had been spared in creating the impression of a well-established, financially secure agency. An agency launched with my money. I paused near a display featuring their new branding system. A sleek, minimalist design with geometric patterns in shades of deep blue and copper. The craftsmanship was undeniably impressive, which made sense given the price tag this level of design commanded. Quite striking, isn't it? A voice said beside me. I turned to find Caroline Winters, creative director at one of the city's largest agencies, and someone I'd met several times at industry events Nathan had insisted I attend with him. It is, I agreed, contemporary but with staying power. Melanie's work, Caroline said, studying the display. She's built quite a reputation in the industry over the past few years. When she left Carson Media, several major clients followed her. Nathan was smart to partner with her. Was he? I kept my tone neutral, conversational. I wasn't aware of the specifics. Caroline glanced around before leaning slightly closer. Between us, Nathan had been trying to recruit her for months before she finally left Carson. The industry rumor was that he offered her full partnership with her name first on the door, something Carson wouldn't match. Another piece of the puzzle clicked into place. While I'd been working late and rising early to prepare for board meetings, Nathan had been orchestrating not just an affair, but a complete professional and personal transition. Interesting strategy, I commented, especially given the capital requirements for such a rapid launch. Caroline nodded. That's the real story everyone's discussing. Most creative startups bootstrap for at least a year, but they've launched fully funded, with premium office space in the Tower District and a client roster most established agencies would envy. The question is, Who's backing them? I took a sip of champagne, using the moment to compose my response. Investment can come from unexpected sources. Indeed. Caroline's gaze was shrewd, assessing. Nathan mentioned you two had known each other for some time. So that was his narrative. We had known each other, a carefully constructed phrase that acknowledged our connection without specifying its nature or extent. Not my wife of 12 years, but a vague acquaintance from his past. We have a long history, I confirmed, deliberately ambiguous, including several joint financial ventures. Before Caroline could pursue this thread further, my attention was caught by a large touchscreen display activated by a group of guests nearby. It featured an interactive portfolio of Westbrook and Harrington's work, including a project I recognized immediately, the rebranding campaign for Harrington Family Vineyards, Nathan's parents' winery in Sonoma. I moved closer, memories surfacing. Unbidden. 3 years ago, Nathan's father had approached us about updating their dated brand identity to appeal to a younger demographic. Nathan had been excited about the creative challenge, but it was I who had spent weekends poring over their financial statements, restructuring their debt, and creating a sustainable business model that could support the investment a proper rebranding would require. The work displayed on the screen represented hundreds of hours of both Nathan's creative input and my financial expertise, a true collaboration that had revitalized his family's struggling business. Now it was showcased as a Westbrook and Harrington project, with no acknowledgement of my contribution. The vineyard rebrand was inspired, said a silver-haired man examining the display. Transformed a conventional family winery into a destination brand practically overnight. Thank you, Nathan's voice responded from behind me. It was a labor of love. I turned to find him approaching with Melanie at his side, their professional smiles firmly in place. They hadn't expected to find me here, studying this particular project. The Harrington Vineyard case study is one of our signature accomplishments, Melanie added, her proprietary tone suggesting she had been part of the project rather than a complete stranger to it. A true transformation, I agreed, meeting Nathan's gaze directly. Though I seem to recall it involved significant financial restructuring alongside the creative elements. Nathan's smile tightened fractionally. Every aspect was carefully considered. I'd be fascinated to hear more about the financial strategy, said the silver-haired man, turning to Melanie. The wine industry can be particularly challenging from a capital perspective. Alexandra would actually be the person to ask about that, Nathan interjected smoothly. She consulted on some of the financial aspects of the project. Consulted. The word hung between us, a deliberate diminishment of my central role in saving his family's business. More than consulted, I corrected mildly. I restructured their debt, renegotiated their distribution contracts, and created the financial model that made the rebranding possible in the first place. The silver-haired man looked between us, sensing the tension. You work together? Often. We were partners, I said simply. Professionally, Nathan added quickly, his tone suggesting a limited business relationship rather than our 12-year marriage. Melanie stepped closer to Nathan, her hand slipping possessively around his arm. Nathan and I believe creative excellence must be paired with solid business strategy. It's the foundation of our approach at Westbrook and Harrington. A philosophy Alexandra and I developed together, Nathan acknowledged reluctantly, the closest he'd come to recognizing our shared history. Some philosophies endure, I observed, even when partnerships change. The double meaning wasn't lost on Nathan. His expression hardened slightly, the professional mask slipping to reveal a flash of the discomfort beneath. Partnerships evolve, he countered. Sometimes a fresh perspective is exactly what's needed to move forward. And sometimes, I replied, my voice carrying just enough edge to make Melanie's perfect smile falter. What appears to be evolution is actually appropriation. The silver-haired man glanced between us, clearly registering the undercurrents. Well, the results speak for themselves. The vineyard's sales increased 40% after the rebrand, didn't they? 43%, I corrected automatically. With a 67% increase in direct-to-consumer revenue through the new e-commerce platform. Nathan looked momentarily startled by my precise recall of the metrics, as if he'd forgotten how deeply involved I had been in every aspect of his family's business. Alexandra has an exceptional memory for figures, he told the man, his tone suggesting this was a curious quirk rather than a professional strength. Occupational necessity, I replied. As CFO of Meridian Global, attention to financial detail is rather fundamental. The silver-haired man's eyebrows rose. You're Meridian's CFO? Impressive position. Alexandra has always been ambitious, Nathan said, the comment framed as a compliment but delivered with a subtle undertone that suggested unchecked ambition, as if my career success had come at a cost. I prefer focused, I countered, particularly when it comes to protecting assets. Melanie, perhaps sensing the conversation veering into dangerous territory, interjected smoothly. The Vineyard Project certainly demonstrated the power of our integrated approach. In fact, we're applying similar principles to our work with Caldwell Industries. I wasn't aware Caldwell had signed with you, I said, knowing full well they hadn't. Robert Caldwell's earlier comments had made that clear. We're in final discussions, Nathan replied, his slight hesitation revealing the exaggeration. Robert was quite impressed with our presentation. Final discussions can be the most critical phase, I observed. That's when the details of ownership and control are established. Nathan's jaw tightened almost imperceptibly. Speaking of presentations, we should check on the multimedia display for the Donovan campaign. It should be ready for the reveal. Of course, Melanie agreed, her relief at the excuse to exit our conversation evident despite her professional smile. If you'll excuse us. As they moved away, the silver-haired man studied me with renewed interest. I sense there's quite a history there. History is filled with valuable lessons, I replied, particularly regarding the importance of reading the fine print before signing away rights. He nodded thoughtfully. I'm Thomas Brennan, by the way, Venture Capital. Alexandra Harrington, I said, accepting his offered hand. Finance. I know who you are, he replied, surprising me. Your reputation extends beyond Meridian. The structured finance model you created for the Asian market expansion was brilliant, innovative yet remarkably stable during last year's volatility. Thank you, I said, genuinely pleased by the recognition. Financial architecture should be both creative and secure. Precisely why I'm confused by your former association with Westbrook and Harrington, he said, lowering his voice slightly. Creative agencies typically represent significant risk with unpredictable returns, not your usual investment profile. The question beneath the observation was clear. What was my connection to this venture? Let's just say I maintain an interest in the agency's financial foundation, I replied carefully, though Nathan and Melanie have complete creative control. Thomas Brennan's gaze sharpened. Interesting arrangement. Passive investment? For now, I said, allowing a small smile. Though as you know, investment terms can always be renegotiated when circumstances change. Indeed they can, he agreed, his expression suggesting newfound respect. And change is the only constant in business. As we continued our conversation, moving to topics of mutual professional interest, I maintained my composed exterior while internally cataloging each new piece of information. The picture becoming increasingly clear. Nathan and Melanie had leveraged my money to create a facade of success, one designed to attract clients and further investment. They had erased my contribution to Nathan's family business, diminished our marriage to a vague professional association, and presented themselves as visionary entrepreneurs rather than opportunistic thieves. But facades, as any financial professional knows, are only as solid as their foundations. And I was beginning to see the structural weaknesses in theirs, vulnerabilities that would be invisible to most observers but glaringly obvious to someone with my particular expertise. Someone who had spent 12 years learning exactly how Nathan operated, both professionally and personally. Someone who understood that appearances of success often concealed fragile financial realities. Someone who knew precisely where to apply pressure when the time came. The evening progressed with the practiced rhythm of high-end networking events, conversations flowing as smoothly as the champagne, business cards exchanged with calculated casualness, and strategic introductions, orchestrated to showcase connections and influence. I navigated this familiar terrain with the precision that had carried me through countless corporate gatherings, maintaining my professional demeanor while continuing to gather information. Around 9 o'clock, the background music faded, and a spotlight illuminated the far end of the room where a small stage had been arranged. Nathan stepped into the light, looking every inch the successful creative director in his tailored charcoal suit and burgundy tie that perfectly complemented Melanie's dress, a coordinated visual statement of their partnership. "Good evening, everyone," he began, his voice carrying confidently across the now quieting room. "Melanie and I want to thank you all for joining us tonight to celebrate the launch of Westbrook and Harrington Creative." Applause rippled through the gathering. I maintained my position near the back of the room, champagne glass in hand, my expression neutral as I watched the man I had supported for 12 years claim this moment of triumph. "Some of you have known me for years," Nathan continued. "You've watched my journey through the creative industry, from junior designer to creative director at Carson Media. No mention of our marriage, of course. No acknowledgement that I had supported him through his early career struggles, had reviewed his portfolio late into the night, had networked on his behalf when he was too introverted to approach industry leaders at events like this one. Others know Melanie from her groundbreaking work with major brands across multiple platforms. Her vision has transformed client outcomes and set new standards for integrated marketing campaigns. Melanie joined him on stage, their body language proclaiming their personal and professional unity. The spotlight caught the diamonds at her throat, a necklace I recognized instantly as having been purchased from the jeweler Nathan and I had patronized for years. I wondered if she knew I had helped select the setting for that particular piece, or that we had discussed giving it to his mother for her 70th birthday. "Together," Melanie said, taking over seamlessly, "we're creating something truly unique in the industry, an agency that bridges the gap between traditional creative excellence and digital innovation. Westbrook and Harrington isn't just another creative shop. We're a strategic partner for brands ready to transform their market position." The practiced patter continued, highlighting their creative philosophy, showcasing key projects, several of which I recognized as work Nathan had begun while still at Carson Media, and outlining their ambitious growth trajectory. The presentation was polished, compelling, and undeniably impressive, exactly what potential clients and industry peers would expect from a well-funded, forward-thinking agency. What no one in the room except me knew was that this entire spectacle, from the premium venue to the custom furniture, from the innovative digital displays to the staffing infrastructure they described, had been financed with my money. Money, transferred without my knowledge or consent while I presented quarterly projections to my board. "We've been fortunate to secure significant investment that allows us to launch with the resources needed to serve major clients from day one," Nathan explained, his eyes sweeping the room with practiced confidence. "Unlike most creative startups, we're fully capitalized with operational runway well beyond industry standards." I took a measured sip of champagne, recognizing the careful wording. Secure significant investment sounded far more professional than drained my wife's savings account while she was in a board meeting. This strategic capitalization allows us to focus entirely on creative excellence rather than financial survival," Melanie added, her smile radiant under the spotlight. "We've assembled a world-class team, secured premium office space in the Tower District, and implemented technology systems that position us at the forefront of the industry." The Tower District. Of course, the exclusive business center where rents averaged triple the city's standard commercial rates. I made a mental note to determine exactly which building they'd leased, another piece in the financial puzzle I was constructing. "But impressive resources mean nothing without vision," Nathan continued. "At Westbrook and Harrington, we believe that transformative creative work happens when boundaries are pushed, when conventional thinking is challenged, when partners trust each other enough to take calculated risks." The irony of Nathan speaking about trust while standing on a stage financed by his betrayal was almost enough to crack my composed facade. Almost. "Which brings us to our exciting announcement," Melanie said, her voice rising with practiced enthusiasm. "We're thrilled to reveal that Westbrook and Harrington has been selected as the creative agency of record for Pinnacle Development's revolutionary new urban living concept, Skyline Commons." Murmurs rippled through the crowd. Pinnacle was one of the largest real estate development firms in the region, known for high-profile, high-budget projects. Landing them as a client was indeed a coup for a new agency, the kind of signature, account that could establish immediate credibility and attract additional premium clients. "Pinnacle's CEO, James Morrison, is here with us tonight," Nathan said, gesturing toward a distinguished man in his 60s standing near the front of the room. "James, would you like to say a few words about our partnership?" As James Morrison moved to join them on stage, I felt a subtle shift in the room's energy, the current of respect and deference that flows toward individuals of significant wealth and influence. Morrison's real estate empire extended beyond the city to developments across the country, his net worth estimated in the billions. His presence lent Nathan and Melanie's launch an implicit endorsement that no amount of sophisticated staging could have achieved. "Thank you, Nathan, Melanie," Morrison said, accepting the microphone with the easy confidence of someone accustomed to addressing crowds. "When my team began searching for a creative partner for Skyline Commons, we interviewed established agencies with decades of experience and impressive client rosters. But what Westbrook and Harrington presented wasn't just creativity, it was vision, innovation, and a financial structure that demonstrated commitment to long-term partnership. Financial structure. I made another mental note, wondering exactly what Nathan and Melanie had proposed that had impressed a business veteran like Morrison. "The Skyline Commons project represents a $400 million investment in urban living," Morrison continued. "We needed partners who understand both creative excellence and financial responsibility. In Nathan and Melanie, we found that rare combination." I nearly laughed aloud at the description of Nathan as financially responsible, but maintained my composed expression as the presentation continued. "Our contract with Westbrook and Harrington is not just for initial branding," Morrison explained, "but a comprehensive 3-year engagement covering all aspects of marketing, advertising, and digital presence for Skyline Commons. We're committing substantial resources to this partnership because we believe in their vision and capabilities. 3 years, comprehensive engagement, substantial resources. Each phrase translated in my financial mind to specific dollar amounts, contract terms, and cash flow projections. This wasn't just a prestigious client. It was a multi-million-dollar account that would provide stable revenue for the fledgling agency through its critical early years. An account secured using my capital as the foundation. In addition," Morrison continued, "I'm pleased to announce that I've personally invested in Westbrook and Harrington as a minority stakeholder. My experience in business development has taught me to recognize exceptional talent and opportunity, and this agency represents both." The revelation sent another ripple of murmurs through the crowd. Morrison's investment was a powerful endorsement, the kind that would open doors throughout the business community and potentially attract additional investment. I watched Nathan's face, noting the flash of triumph in his eyes. This was more than he had hoped for, not just a major client, but a billionaire investor publicly declaring his faith in their venture. From the whispered conversations around me, I could tell this announcement had transformed the event from an impressive agency launch to a significant industry moment. As Nathan, Melanie, and Morrison continued their presentation, outlining their shared vision for Skyline Commons and displaying preliminary concepts on the large screens, I observed the shifting dynamics in the room. Industry peers who had been cordially interested were now actively engaged. Potential clients who had been adopting wait-and-see positions were moving closer to the stage, and competitors were exchanging concerned glances. In 30 minutes, Nathan and Melanie had positioned themselves not as industry newcomers, but as significant players with financial backing and client relationships that established agencies would envy. The narrative they were crafting was compelling, aspirational, and, based on what I knew of their actual financial foundation, dangerously misleading. When the presentation concluded, thunderous applause filled the room. Nathan and Melanie stood center stage, Morrison beside them, the spotlight illuminating their triumphant expressions. They had orchestrated this moment perfectly, the public validation of their venture, the implicit message that they were not just creative talents but business forces to be reckoned with. As the formal presentation ended and the networking resumed with renewed energy, I watched Nathan and Melanie work the room with practiced coordination. They moved from group to group, Melanie captivating potential clients with her creative vision, while Nathan provided the strategic context, their choreography so seamless it suggested years of partnership rather than months. Thomas Brennan materialized beside me, his expression thoughtful as he observed the same dynamic. "Impressive announcement," he commented. "Morrison's involvement changes the equation considerably." "It does," I agreed, "though I wonder if he's performed proper due diligence on their financial foundation." "Morrison didn't build his empire by making careless investments," Brennan noted. "His team would have scrutinized their capitalization and business plan thoroughly." "Perhaps," I said, "but even the most thorough due diligence can miss crucial details if they're deliberately obscured." Brennan studied me with renewed interest. "You sound like you have specific concerns." "Let's just say I have questions about the source of their launch capital," I replied carefully. "Questions that might interest someone like Morrison if brought to his attention." "Financial impropriety?" Brennan asked, lowering his voice. "Impropriety implies illegality," I corrected. "This is more a matter of ethical considerations and potential reputational risk." Before Brennan could pursue this line of questioning further, I noticed Nathan and Melanie approaching with James Morrison in tow, a deliberate movement in my direction that suggested Nathan had finally decided to address my presence directly, perhaps emboldened by Morrison's public endorsement. "Alexandra," Nathan said as they reached us, his tone suggesting casual acquaintanceship rather than our 12-year marriage. "I don't believe you've met James Morrison. James, this is Alexandra Harrington, CFO of Meridian Global." Morrison extended his hand. "A pleasure, Miss Harrington. Your reputation precedes you." "Likewise, Mr. Morrison," I replied, accepting his handshake. "Your urban development projects have transformed several cities for the better." "You're familiar with our work?" he asked, seemingly pleased. "I make it my business to understand major capital investments in the markets where Meridian operates," I explained. "Your Riverside project in particular represents an innovative approach to mixed-use development financing." Morrison's expression brightened with genuine interest. "Not many people appreciate the financial architecture behind the projects. They see the buildings, not the capital structures that make them possible." "Alexandra has always had a particular fascination with financial details," Nathan interjected, his tone suggesting this was a quirky interest rather than the professional expertise that had built my career. "Not fascination," I corrected mildly. "Expertise. In my experience, Understanding the foundation is essential to evaluating the stability of any structure, whether physical or financial. Morrison's genuine interest in financial structures created a moment of authentic connection that momentarily eclipsed Nathan's attempt to diminish my professional standing. I watched the calculation play across Nathan's features, frustration, quickly masked by his practiced networking smile. Alexandra's expertise in corporate finance is indeed impressive, Nathan conceded, attempting to regain control of the conversation. Though quite different from the entrepreneurial approach we've taken with Westbrook and Harrington. Different perspectives often yield the strongest partnerships, Morrison replied, seemingly oblivious to the undercurrents between us. The creative vision that Nathan and Melanie bring, combined with solid financial planning, creates a powerful foundation for business growth. I couldn't agree more, I said. Proper financial structuring is essential to sustainable creative ventures. I've always believed that creativity flourishes best when built on solid fiscal planning rather than improvised funding. Nathan's smile tightened almost imperceptibly. Our funding structure is quite sophisticated for an agency at our stage. We've moved beyond traditional startup models. Clearly, I replied, meeting his gaze directly. The speed of your launch suggests access to significant capital. Most new ventures struggle with liquidity constraints during their first year. Melanie slipped her arm through Nathan's, a gesture that appeared affectionate but served to assert her position. We were fortunate to secure investment from partners who recognize our vision and potential. It's allowed us to bypass many of the typical startup challenges. Fortune does favor the bold, I acknowledged, lifting my champagne glass slightly. Though in my experience, unexpected windfalls often come with strings attached. Thomas. Brennan, who had been observing our exchange with keen interest, chose this moment to rejoin the conversation. Speaking of investment structures, James, I've been intrigued by the capital stack you developed for the Skyline Commons project. The blend of traditional financing with opportunity zone incentives is quite innovative. Morrison turned toward Brennan with evident enthusiasm for the subject, momentarily shifting the focus away from Nathan and Melanie's funding sources. We've leveraged several emerging tax vehicles that offer remarkable flexibility while maintaining impressive returns for our investors. As Morrison and Brennan delved into the intricacies of real estate financing, I observed Nathan's posture relax slightly, relieved by the change in subject. Melanie, however, continued to study me with calculated assessment, her professional smile not quite reaching her eyes. "Your dress is stunning," she said suddenly, changing tactics with practiced smoothness. "Valentino, isn't it? From last season's collection?" The unexpected pivot to fashion was a classic redirection strategy, an attempt to establish common ground on traditionally feminine territory rather than continuing the more threatening discussion of financial structures. I recognized the technique from countless corporate situations where men had attempted to steer conversations with female executives away from business topics and toward more appropriate subjects. "Thank you," I replied simply, though I find investment patterns considerably more interesting than designer collections. Nathan, sensing my resistance to Melanie's attempt at redirection, rejoined the conversation with renewed purpose. "Alexandra has always been focused on business above all else," he told Melanie, his tone suggesting this was a character flaw rather than a professional strength. Even during our previous association, the carefully neutral phrasing hung between us, his deliberate avoidance of acknowledging our marriage. Maintaining focus is essential in both finance and relationships, I replied, evenly, as is transparency regarding shared assets. Before Nathan could respond, we were interrupted by the approach of a photographer wielding a professional camera. "Mr. Morrison, Mr. Harrington, Ms. Westbrook, could I get a photo for the gay business section? The agency launch with Mr. Morrison's investment announcement is definitely front-page material." "Of course," Morrison agreed affably. I stepped back, prepared to exit the frame, but Morrison gestured for me to remain. Ms. Harrington should join us. Having Meridian's CFO in the shot would add another layer of financial credibility. Nathan's expression flickered momentarily before his professional mask reasserted itself. Excellent idea, he managed, though the slight strain in his voice was evident to anyone who knew him well. We arranged ourselves with practiced ease, Morrison in the center, Nathan and Melanie to his right, myself to his left. As we stood there, smiling for the camera, I felt the surreal quality of the moment intensify. Here I was, posing alongside my husband of 12 years, the woman he'd betrayed me with, and a billionaire investor who had no idea that the impressive financial structure he was praising had been built with money transferred from my account without consent. Perfect, the photographer declared after several rapid clicks. This will accompany the feature on emerging business partnerships in tomorrow's edition. As the photographer moved away, Morrison turned to me with genuine interest. I'd love to hear your perspective on the current investment climate for creative ventures, Ms. Harrington. Perhaps we could arrange a lunch next week? My team is always looking to refine our approach to diversified investment. Before I could respond, Nathan interjected smoothly. Alexandra's schedule is notoriously full with her Meridian responsibilities. Corporate finance demands constant attention, doesn't it? The presumption that he could still speak for me, still manage my professional connections, sent a flash of cold anger through me, an emotion I acknowledged internally but kept carefully concealed behind my professional demeanor. I appreciate the interest, Mr. Morrison, I replied, ignoring Nathan entirely. I'd be happy to discuss investment trends in the creative sector. My assistant can coordinate with your team for a suitable time next week. Morrison nodded with evident satisfaction. Excellent. I found that creative financing often requires creative thinking, something traditional banking can sometimes lack. The most sophisticated financial structures often appear deceptively simple on the surface, I agreed. It's only when you examine the underlying documentation that the true complexity and potential vulnerabilities become apparent. Nathan shifted his weight slightly, the only outward sign of his discomfort with the direction of our conversation. Melanie, perhaps sensing his unease, employed another redirection. The chamber orchestra is about to perform the piece we commissioned specifically for our launch, she announced. We should move toward the main gallery for the best acoustics. James, there are several people you simply must meet before the performance begins. Her tone made it clear that this was not merely a suggestion, but a calculated extraction. Morrison, ever the gentleman, nodded his agreement. A pleasure meeting you, Ms. Harrington, he said. I look forward to our lunch. Likewise, I replied. I'm particularly interested in discussing due diligence approaches for creative industry investments. A flicker of something, concern, perhaps, or simple curiosity, crossed Morrison's expression before Melanie successfully steered him away, Nathan following closely behind. As they moved through the crowd, I noted how skillfully Melanie had managed the situation, recognizing the potential danger in my continued conversation, with Morrison in executing a graceful but firm redirection. In another circumstance, I might have admired her tactical awareness. Tonight, I simply filed it away as additional information about a formidable opponent. Thomas Brennan remained beside me, his expression thoughtful as he observed Nathan, Melanie, and Morrison being absorbed into a new conversation cluster across the room. Interesting dynamics, he commented. I sense there's considerably more to your previous association with Harrington than either of you is acknowledging publicly. I took a measured sip of champagne. History often provides valuable context for present situations. History and financial entanglements, Brennan noted. Your comments about their funding sources weren't just theoretical concerns, were they? His perception was sharper than I had anticipated. I considered my response carefully, weighing the potential value of a partial disclosure against the risks of revealing too much too soon. Let's just say I have a vested interest in understanding exactly how Westbrook and Harrington's impressive launch was financed, I replied. As does anyone considering business relationships with them. Brennan studied me for a moment longer, then nodded slightly, accepting my measured response without pressing further. The professional courtesy of one financial expert to another. Morrison's involvement changes their trajectory significantly, he observed instead. His investment alone will attract attention, but his client relationship legitimizes them instantly in the industry. Appearance and reality don't always align in business launches, I noted, particularly when fundamental questions about capitalization remain unanswered. True enough, Brennan agreed. I've seen impressive facades collapse when the financial foundation proved inadequate, though Morrison's team typically performs rigorous due diligence. Due diligence is only as thorough as the information provided, I countered. Sophisticated financial maneuvers can sometimes obscure underlying vulnerabilities, temporarily. Our conversation was interrupted by the subtle dimming of lights, signaling the start of the commissioned musical performance. Guests began moving toward the main gallery, creating natural movement that separated us. Brennan nodded respectfully before being drawn into conversation with another attendee, leaving me momentarily alone amidst the shifting crowd. I used the opportunity to observe Nathan and Melanie from a distance as they positioned themselves prominently near Morrison, their body language projecting confidence and easy familiarity with their surroundings. They looked every inch the successful, dynamic partners, professional and personal, that their carefully orchestrated launch was designed to present to the world. The facade was impressive, I had to admit. If I hadn't known the truth, that their venture was built on stolen funds and betrayal, I might have been convinced by the performance they were staging. The venue, the client announcement, Morrison's investment, the commissioned music, the curated guest list, all elements of a strategically crafted narrative designed to establish them immediately as industry leaders rather than newcomers. As the string quartet began their performance, a modern composition with classical undertones that perfectly matched the sophisticated aesthetic of the event, I maintained my position at the periphery, sipping champagne and considering my next steps. The evening had provided valuable intelligence, confirmation of their major client, knowledge of Morrison's investment, awareness of their office location, insights into their business positioning. Each piece of information represented a potential pressure point, a vulnerability that could be leveraged when the time was right. But timing would be crucial. Moving too quickly might allow Nathan to construct countermeasures. Waiting too long would give their narrative time to solidify in the industry's perception. A server approached with a fresh tray of champagne. As I exchanged my empty glass for a full one, I caught Nathan watching me from across the room, his expression momentarily unguarded. Beneath the triumphant confidence he'd displayed throughout the evening, I glimpsed something else. Uncertainty, perhaps even a flicker of guilt, before Melanie recaptured his attention with a light touch on his arm. The moment confirmed what I had suspected throughout the evening. Beneath his carefully constructed facade of success and new beginnings, Nathan was acutely aware of what he had done and concerned about how I might respond. His apprehension was well-founded. I had maintained my composure throughout this evening of calculated humiliation, watching him showcase a business built with my money, hearing him diminish our marriage to a vague, previous association, observing him flaunt his relationship with Melanie in front of industry peers who had attended our anniversary celebrations. I had smiled politely, exchanged pleasantries, and networked effectively, giving no outward indication that anything was amiss. I had, in short, behaved exactly as Nathan had expected, the consummate professional too concerned with appearances to create a scene. What he didn't understand, what he had never fully appreciated despite our 12 years together, was that my composure wasn't a limitation. It was my greatest strength. The same disciplined restraint that had built my career, that had guided Meridian through market turbulence, that had transformed Nathan's family vineyard from failing enterprise to thriving business. That focused, control was now directed toward a single objective, not revenge. Something far more precise: accountability. The string quartet's final notes faded into appreciative applause, signaling the transition back to the networking portion of the evening. Guests resumed their conversations with renewed energy, the subtle shift in room dynamics suggesting the event had reached its peak. Within an hour, attendance would begin to thin as people made strategic exits, careful to be seen but not to overstay. I was considering my own departure, having gathered sufficient intelligence for one evening, when I observed Nathan and Melanie making a deliberate approach in my direction. Their body language suggested purpose rather than casual mingling, and the collection of people they were bringing with them indicated a planned conversation rather than a spontaneous encounter. I recognized several faces in their entourage: Robert Caldwell from earlier in the evening, Patricia Alvarez, creative director at a competing agency, and two individuals I identified as potential clients based on their visitor badges and the attentive way Nathan had been cultivating them throughout the night. Morrison was notably absent, having been drawn into conversation with several real estate developers near the bar. "Alexandra, there you are," Nathan called as they approached, his tone suggesting we had been engaged in ongoing friendly interaction throughout the evening rather than strategic avoidance. "I wanted to make sure you met the Dennison team before you left." The calculated nature of this approach was immediately apparent. Nathan had deliberately assembled an audience for whatever was about to unfold, people with industry influence who would carry the narrative forward. "Mark and Stephanie Dennison are launching a new wellness brand," Nathan continued, gesturing to the couple I had correctly identified as potential clients. "Their approach to holistic health solutions aligns perfectly with Westbrook and Harrington's integrated marketing philosophy." "Lovely to meet you," I said, extending my hand with professional courtesy. "Your entry into the wellness space comes at an interesting time. The sector is experiencing significant capital influx, but also increasing regulatory scrutiny." Mark Dennison, a trim man in his 40s with the carefully maintained physique of someone who embodied his brand, nodded appreciatively. "That's precisely why we're being so selective about our partnerships. The marketing message needs to align with regulatory boundaries without losing its impact." "Alexandra always brings conversations back to regulations and restrictions," Nathan commented, his tone light but carrying a subtle barb. "Even during our previous collaboration, she was the voice of limitation rather than possibility." And there it was, the first calculated diminishment, positioned as casual reminiscence, but designed to frame me as the constraining influence that had held back his creative potential during our marriage. "I prefer to think of it as the voice of sustainability," I countered smoothly. "Creative visions require solid foundations to flourish long-term. Without proper structure, even the most brilliant concepts can collapse under market pressures." "Structure is essential," Stephanie Dennison agreed. "We've seen too many wellness brands launch with splashy marketing but insufficient operational planning." Nathan's expression flickered briefly before he redirected. "Speaking of launches, the Dennisons were just asking about our approach to funding creative startups. As someone with financial expertise, perhaps you could share some insights on traditional corporate models versus entrepreneurial approaches." The question was a trap, an invitation to publicly criticize their funding approach, which would position me as bitter or jealous of their success rather than legitimately concerned about misappropriated funds. "Funding models vary widely," I replied instead, addressing the Dennisons directly. "The key questions always involve transparency with stakeholders and proper documentation of capital sources. Creative entrepreneurs sometimes focus so intently on their vision that they neglect the foundational legal structures that protect both the business and its investors." Patricia Alvarez, the creative director who had been observing our exchange, with evident interest, leaned forward. I heard a fascinating rumor that Westbrook and Harrington secured their impressive launch capital through some innovative financial vehicle that Nathan developed during his previous agency experience. Is that accurate, Nathan? The deliberate question created an opening for Nathan to craft his preferred narrative about their funding sources, an opportunity he seized immediately. Innovation often happens at the intersection of disciplines, he responded, his practiced humility not quite masking his satisfaction at directing the conversation. My years working with financial clients provided insights into capital structures that most creative professionals never encounter. Melanie, and I simply applied those principles to our own venture. I maintained my composed expression, though internally I noted the careful construction of his response. Technically truthful in that he had indeed applied financial knowledge gained during our marriage, yet entirely misleading about the actual source of their capital. Nathan has always had a talent for recognizing opportunity, Melanie added, her hand sliding possessively around his arm. When he explained his vision for our funding approach, I knew it was exactly the innovative thinking the industry needed. The possessive gesture, the deliberate use of our, the implication of shared creation, each element carefully choreographed, to reinforce their partnership narrative while erasing my existence. Vision without proper execution can lead to significant liability, I noted, particularly when financial innovations involve other parties' resources. Robert Caldwell, who had been quietly observing our exchange, chose this moment to interject. Speaking of resources, Nathan mentioned you've built quite an impressive investment portfolio over the years, Alexandra. He says your financial acumen is unmatched in personal wealth management as well as corporate finance. The comment caught me off guard, not because it was untrue, but because it represented Nathan sharing personal details about me with his business associates. Details that should have remained private between spouses. Nathan exaggerates, I replied carefully. I apply the same principles to personal finance that I use in my corporate role: diversification, appropriate risk assessment, and careful documentation of transactions. Always the meticulous record keeper, Nathan said, his tone making it sound like a character flaw rather than a professional strength. Alexandra maintained spreadsheets tracking every expenditure during our previous association. I used to joke that she could account for every coffee purchase over a decade. Laughter rippled through the small group, polite, uncomfortable laughter that acknowledged the increasing tension beneath our exchange. Accurate records prevent unfortunate surprises, I replied evenly, particularly regarding shared resources. That must be a challenging approach in a relationship context, Melanie observed, her sympathetic tone belied by the calculation in her eyes. Partnerships thrive on trust rather than documentation, don't they? The deliberate pivot to relationship dynamics rather than business principles was transparent, a subtle attempt to frame me as cold and untrusting, contrasting with her warmer, more intuitive approach to both business and personal relationships. Trust and documentation are complementary, not contradictory, I countered. The strongest partnerships, whether business or personal, balance emotional connection with clear agreements about shared resources and responsibilities. That's certainly one perspective, Melanie replied, her perfect smile not quite reaching. Her eyes. Nathan and I have found that creative intuition and mutual trust create more dynamic outcomes than rigid structures and constant verification. The implicit message was clear. She offered Nathan something I had not: freedom from oversight, unconditional support of his vision, partnership without accountability. The narrative they were constructing positioned their relationship as liberating, compared to the constraints of our marriage. Nathan, perhaps sensing that the conversation was veering too close to our personal history, attempted another redirect. The Dennisons were particularly impressed with our approach to integrated campaigns. Mark, didn't you mention your interest in exploring blockchain applications for customer loyalty programs? Before Mark could respond, Patricia Alvarez, who had been watching our exchange with the sharp attention of someone mentally taking notes, interjected with unexpected directness. "I have to ask what everyone's been wondering," she said, her tone suggesting the impatience of someone cutting through social niceties. "Were you two previously married? The industry has been buzzing with speculation all evening." A momentary silence fell over our small group. I watched Nathan's expression flicker through rapid calculations, weighing the risks of acknowledgement against continued obfuscation, considering how either choice would affect the narrative he was constructing. "Alexandra and I were married, yes," he finally admitted, his tone suggesting this was a minor biographical detail rather than a 12-year commitment. "We divorced last year when our paths diverged professionally and personally. We've both moved onto more compatible partnerships." The casual dismissal of our marriage, reduced to diverging paths rather than his betrayal and theft, was delivered with such confident finality that for a moment I felt as if I were watching a performance about strangers rather than experiencing my own life. "Though we finalized our divorce just 8 weeks ago," I corrected mildly, "not last year." The precise timeline hung in the air between us, quietly contradicting his attempt to suggest our marriage was long behind him. Several members of our small audience exchanged glances, recalibrating their understanding of the situation. Nathan recovered quickly. "Time is relative in transition periods," he said with a practiced, self-deprecating smile. Emotionally, we had moved in different directions long before the paperwork caught up. "How diplomatic," Patricia commented, her tone making it clear she recognized the strategic narrative management at play. "Though it must be awkward, launching a new venture with funds from a recently dissolved marriage." The direct acknowledgement of the financial question created another moment of tense silence. I observed Nathan's shoulders tighten almost imperceptibly as he formulated his response. "Financial settlements in divorce are standard procedure," he replied smoothly. "Alexandra and I reached an equitable agreement that allowed both of us to pursue our respective goals without constraint." The deliberate mischaracterization, framing his theft as a mutually agreed settlement, was delivered with such conviction that I momentarily admired his sheer audacity. He met my gaze with practiced confidence, silently daring me to contradict him in this public setting. "Settlements typically involve negotiation and documentation," I noted, maintaining my professional tone despite the growing coldness in my chest. "Not unilateral action during the other party's board meeting." A subtle ripple of reaction moved through our small audience, eyes widening slightly, postures shifting as they registered the implications of my statement. Nathan's expression hardened momentarily before he reasserted his networking smile. "Legal perspectives often differ during complex transitions," he said dismissively. "The important outcome is that both parties can move forward productively. Wouldn't you agree, Alexandra? Productivity should never come at the expense of integrity," I replied, "particularly when building new partnerships." Melanie, perhaps sensing the conversation had reached dangerous territory, employed another redirection. "Mark, Stephanie, you mentioned wanting to see our preliminary concepts for the wellness app interface before you left. The digital display in the East Gallery has the interactive prototype ready for demonstration." "Oh!" The subtle tension that had been building throughout our exchange suddenly shifted as Melanie expertly guided the denizens toward the digital display. Her intervention was perfectly timed. Before my pointed reference to integrity could fully register with our audience, she had created movement and purpose that fractured the group's attention. "We should absolutely look at those prototypes," Mark Dennison agreed, clearly relieved by the change in conversational direction. "Stephanie has been particularly interested in the user experience design." As the denizens prepared to follow, Nathan seized the moment to regain control of the narrative. "Alexandra, before you go, I wanted to mention something that might interest you professionally. James Morrison mentioned Meridian might be exploring financing options for the eastern expansion of Skyline Commons." The strategic pivot was masterful, simultaneously asserting his connection to Morrison. implying insider knowledge about Meridian's business development and repositioning our interaction from personal history to professional opportunity. Meridian evaluates numerous financing opportunities, I replied neutrally, though I'm surprised Mr. Morrison would discuss potential deals during a social event. James and I have developed a rather candid relationship, Nathan countered, his tone suggesting privileged access to the billionaire. He values my perspective on creative approaches to business challenges. Robert Caldwell nodded sagely. Morrison's always been one to recognize talent across traditional boundaries. It's why he's succeeded where others have failed. Nathan's expression registered satisfaction at this external validation. Alexandra, perhaps we could schedule a proper meeting next week. There might be collaborative potential between Meridian's financing capabilities and Westbrook and Harrington's relationship with Morrison Development. The proposition was audacious, suggesting a business relationship as if our personal history were irrelevant, positioning himself as a valuable connection to Morrison rather than acknowledging that I had established my own direct contact. More significantly, he was implying to our audience that whatever had transpired between us was minor enough to be set aside for professional advantage. Patricia Alvarez watched this exchange with undisguised interest, clearly cataloging details for future industry gossip. The dynamics at play were too juicy to ignore. The recently divorced couple, the new partner, the financial implications, the power positioning. I considered my options carefully. A direct refusal would appear unprofessional, potentially reinforcing Nathan's implied narrative that I was allowing emotional considerations to override business sense. Accepting would legitimize his framing of our situation and potentially create complications I didn't need. The optimal response would maintain my professional standing while creating appropriate distance. My assistant manages my meeting schedule, I replied smoothly. Feel free to reach out through proper channels if you have a specific proposal that benefits Meridian's stakeholders. Though I should note that our compliance protocols regarding conflict of interest have become quite stringent recently. The measured response accomplished several objectives simultaneously: maintaining professional courtesy, establishing proper business boundaries, subtly reminding our audience that there were ethical considerations at play, and most importantly, denying Nathan the satisfaction of either an emotional reaction or an easy victory. Always the stickler for protocols, Nathan commented with a practiced smile that didn't reach his eyes. Some things never change. Consistency is underrated in both finance and character, I replied. Speaking of which, I should be consistent about not staying too late at industry events. Early board call tomorrow. The reference to board responsibilities served as both a legitimate reason for departure and a subtle reminder of my senior executive position, contextualizing our respective professional standings for anyone observing our interaction. Board meetings on Saturdays? Patricia asked, her tone suggesting she recognized this as a graceful exit strategy rather than literal truth. Global markets don't observe weekends, I responded with a professional smile, particularly when coordinating with Asian investors. Nathan recognized the maneuver for what it was, a strategic retreat on my terms rather than continued engagement on his. A flicker of frustration crossed his features before he reasserted his networking expression. "Don't let us keep you from your corporate responsibilities," he said, his tone making it clear he was positioning my departure as prioritizing work over social connection, reinforcing the implicit narrative that our marriage had suffered from. My professional focus. I turned to Robert Caldwell and Patricia Alvarez. "Lovely to reconnect with you both. Perhaps we'll cross paths at the Chamber of Commerce dinner next month?" "I'll be there," Patricia confirmed, her sharp gaze suggesting she found our interaction far more interesting than the typical industry networking event. Though I imagine the dynamics will be quite different once news of Morrison's investment in Westbrook and Harrington has circulated through the business community. "Success creates its own narrative," Nathan interjected before I could respond. We're fortunate that James recognized our potential so quickly. Patricia's gaze shifted between us, clearly sensing the undercurrents beneath our polite exchange. Recognition comes in many forms, she observed. Sometimes the most interesting stories are those still unfolding behind the headlines. Her perceptiveness was unsettling, a reminder that, in our industry, personal dynamics were never truly separate from professional reputations. Whatever transpired between Nathan, Melanie, and me would inevitably become part of a larger narrative that would circulate through business circles, influencing perceptions and opportunities. The best stories reveal themselves in their own time, I replied, maintaining eye contact with Patricia rather than Nathan, though financial documentation often provides spoilers for the final chapter. With that parting observation, purposefully, ambiguous yet pointed enough to unsettle Nathan, I shook hands with Robert and Patricia, nodded politely to Nathan, and began my calculated exit from the event. As I made my way through the thinning crowd, I maintained a deliberate pace, unhurried, composed, exchanging brief pleasantries with acquaintances rather than rushing toward the exit. This wasn't merely about leaving with dignity. It was about controlling the visual narrative of my departure. Anyone observing would see a confident executive concluding a professional appearance, not a wounded ex-wife fleeing an uncomfortable encounter. Near the coat check, I encountered Thomas Brennan. Again, now deep in conversation with a woman I recognized as the investment director for a major regional bank. He paused their discussion as I approached. "Leaving already, Alexandra?" he asked. "The evening seems to be reaching its most interesting phase." "The most valuable intelligence is gathered early," I replied, keeping my voice low enough to remain between us. "Before people have had too much champagne and start embellishing their narratives." Brennan smiled appreciatively at the observation. "I've found the same to be true, though sometimes the embellishments reveal more than the prepared statements. In this case, I've seen enough to form preliminary conclusions," I said. "Though, I expect the full story will continue to develop in revealing ways." The investment director, sensing our exchange contained subtext beyond her context, excused herself to refresh her drink, leaving Brennan and me momentarily isolated in the crowded room. "Morrison's involvement changes the equation considerably," Brennan noted, his tone measured and analytical, though his enthusiasm seemed primarily directed toward the creative aspects rather than the financial structure. "Typical of early-stage investment enthusiasm," I observed. "The excitement of possibility often overshadows due diligence regarding capitalization sources." "You mentioned concerns about their funding earlier," Brennan said, his voice dropping. "Further, given your professional position and apparent personal history with Harrington, I assume those concerns aren't merely theoretical." I met his gaze directly, assessing his intentions. Thomas Brennan wasn't merely making conversation. As a venture capitalist specializing in creative industry startups, he had a professional interest in identifying both opportunities and risks in the market. Moreover, his reputation suggested he valued substantive integrity in his investments, not just surface appearances. Let's just say that if I were considering investment in Westbrook and Harrington, I would insist on complete transparency regarding the source of their initial capitalization, I replied carefully, particularly regarding any transactions dated within the past 60 days. Brennan's expression sharpened with interest, 60 days being the standard look-back period for certain financial claims. "Precisely," I confirmed, though documentation often tells a more complete story than verbal assurances. He nodded thoughtfully. "Documentation has been the salvation and downfall of many promising ventures. The paper trail rarely lies, even when the narrative does." "Indeed," I agreed. "And in my experience, transactional timestamps are particularly illuminating when compared against other significant events. The deliberately opaque exchange contained enough specificity for a financial professional like Brennan to grasp my implications without requiring explicit statements that might later prove problematic. His thoughtful expression suggested he was piecing together the situation with considerable accuracy. "I appreciate the professional courtesy of this conversation," he said finally. "Investment communities are smaller than most people realize. Reputational considerations often outlast immediate profit opportunities." "My thoughts exactly," I replied, accepting my coat from the attendant who had retrieved it during our conversation. "Transparency prevents unfortunate surprises for all stakeholders." As I prepared to depart, Brennan offered his business card, a simple, elegant design on heavyweight stock that signaled quality without ostentation. "If your professional paths cross with Meridian's venture division, I'd welcome the opportunity to discuss potential synergies." I accepted the card, recognizing the offered connection for what it was, not merely professional networking, but a subtle acknowledgement of aligned perspectives regarding financial integrity. "I'll keep that in mind," I said, offering my own card in return, "though my immediate focus will be on some personal financial recalibration." He registered the deliberate phrasing with a slight nod. "Recalibration often creates unexpected opportunities. I look forward to seeing how yours develops." With that exchange concluded, I made my final exit from the launch party. As the elevator doors closed behind me, I allowed myself a moment of private reflection, the first break in the composed facade I had maintained throughout the evening. The intelligence gathered had been valuable, perhaps even more so than I had anticipated. Morrison's investment changed the dynamics considerably, elevating Westbrook and Harrington from mere industry newcomers to potentially significant players. Their client acquisition, particularly Pinnacle Developments, provided immediate revenue stability that most startups lacked. Yet beneath these apparent strengths, I had identified crucial vulnerabilities, most notably in Nathan's carefully constructed narrative about their funding sources, his avoidance of specifics when discussing capitalization, his reframing of our divorce timeline, his vague references to innovative financial vehicles, rather than concrete explanations. Each evasion represented a weakness in the foundation of his new venture. As the elevator descended toward the lobby, I reviewed my mental inventory of actions to take tomorrow. First, formal documentation of the unauthorized transfers, establishing a clear timeline that aligned with my board meeting schedule. Second, a careful review of our divorce proceedings, identifying any provisions regarding division of assets that Nathan had violated. Third, preliminary research on Morrison's investment, determining whether he had conducted proper due diligence regarding their capitalization or had relied primarily on Nathan and Melanie's representations. The elevator reached the lobby, its soft chime interrupting my strategic planning. As I crossed the marble floor toward the building's entrance, I caught a glimpse of my reflection in the polished brass of a decorative wall panel. Poised, professional, composed. Not the devastated wife Nathan might have expected after discovering his betrayal and theft. Not the emotional casualty struggling to maintain dignity at his triumphant launch. Not the diminished ex-partner he had positioned me as throughout the evening. Instead, I saw what Nathan had consistently underestimated throughout our marriage. A strategic financial mind accustomed to analyzing weaknesses in business structures and identifying leverage points for negotiation. The cool evening air greeted me as I exited the building, a refreshing contrast to the emotional undercurrents of the event I'd just navigated. My driver, alerted by the app on my phone, was already pulling up to the curb in the sleek black sedan that had become my preferred transportation since the divorce proceedings began. As I settled into the back seat, I allowed myself one small, private smile, not of vindictiveness or bitterness, but of clarity and purpose. Nathan believed he had executed a flawless exit strategy, transitioning seamlessly from our marriage to his new venture with Melanie, financing his ambitions with my savings, crafting a narrative that positioned him as the visionary creative, finally freed from constraint. What he failed to realize was that this wasn't the end of our story. It was merely the beginning of mine. The ride home provided a welcome buffer between the calculated performances of the evening and the focused planning that would begin tomorrow. As the sedan glided through nighttime streets, I gazed at the city lights reflecting off glass towers and contemplated the events of the past 3 days, from the moment my phone vibrated during the board meeting to the carefully orchestrated humiliation I had just navigated. "Long evening, Ms. Harrington?" my driver asked, catching my eye briefly in the rearview mirror. "Informative," I replied, my tone suggesting it had been professionally useful rather than personally enjoyable. "Back to your residence, then?" I hesitated, considering my next steps. The townhouse Nathan and I had shared for the last 7 years of our marriage now felt like a museum of abandoned expectations rather than a home. I had maintained it during the divorce proceedings partly out of practicality. The real estate market favored a deliberate sale rather than a rushed liquidation, and partly from a desire to maintain some semblance of stability during the upheaval. But after tonight's revelations, the prospect of returning to that space filled with echoes of our shared life felt counterproductive to the clarity I needed. "The office instead, please," I decided. "Meridian Tower." The driver nodded without comment, adjusting our route. Like many senior executives, I maintained a private apartment adjacent to my office suite, a practical solution for late working nights and early international calls that eliminated commuting time during critical financial periods. Tonight, that space offered something more valuable than convenience: neutral territory, free from emotional associations and optimized for strategic thinking. As we turned toward the financial district, my phone chimed with an incoming text. I expected it to be from Nathan, some calculated follow-up to our encounter designed to further his preferred narrative, but instead found a message from an unfamiliar number. "Tomorrow, 10 a.m., Riverside Park bench near the Japanese maple. Information. About WH creative funding structure you'll find interesting. Come alone." The cryptic message sent a ripple of intrigue through my analytical mind. Anonymous sources were typically unreliable in both financial and personal matters, yet the specific reference to Westbrook and Harrington's funding structure, the precise issue at the center of my concerns, suggested legitimacy. The chosen meeting location was public enough for safety but secluded enough for privacy, indicating someone with both caution and purpose. I considered possible senders: a disgruntled employee from Carson Media who knew of Nathan and Melanie's actions before their departure, someone from the banking side who had processed the transfers, a colleague of Nathan's who had witnessed something relevant to my situation. Whoever had sent it clearly knew enough about my circumstances to understand what information would interest me, yet preferred anonymity over direct identification. Most significantly, they had obtained my personal number, not publicly available and carefully guarded in my professional sphere. I typed a response, then paused to consider my wording. Engaging with anonymous sources carried risk, yet dismissing potentially valuable intelligence would be equally unwise. After careful consideration, I sent a deliberately ambiguous reply. "Information requires verification. What assurance of validity?" The response came almost immediately. Bank transfer timestamps compared against board meeting schedule. Authorization codes, documented communication between parties. My breath caught slightly. The level of specificity suggested not merely gossip or speculation, but access to actual financial documentation, precisely the evidence I would need to establish Nathan's actions as unauthorized appropriation rather than the equitable settlement he had described to others. Of course, the specificity could also indicate a carefully constructed trap, perhaps Nathan attempting to determine my intentions or gather information about my planned response to his actions. The timing seemed suspiciously convenient, coming immediately after our encounter at the launch party. I weighed my options as the car navigated the increasingly empty streets. Approaching an anonymous meeting without precautions would be foolish, yet dismissing a potential source of crucial, Documentation could prove equally costly. The optimal approach would involve both verification and protection. Verification first. Send sample documentation to establish credibility. A longer pause followed this request, suggesting either hesitation or the gathering of materials. The sedan turned onto the broad avenue leading to Meridian Tower, its distinctive illuminated spire visible against the night sky, as my phone chimed again. Rather than text, the message contained an image, a partial screenshot of a bank transfer. Confirmation. Though deliberately cropped to reveal only limited information, I could clearly identify the transfer amount, $267,194.32. The precise figure that had been withdrawn from our joint account during my board meeting. More significantly, the timestamp was visible, 2:42 p.m. on Tuesday, exactly when I had been presenting quarterly projections to the board. The partial account number matched our joint savings, and while the recipient information was mostly redacted, the first letter M was visible. M for Melanie. This was not publicly available information. The precise timing, the exact amount, the account details, these were known only to me, to Nathan, to Melanie, and to whoever had processed or had access to the transaction records. The implications were significant. Someone with inside knowledge of the financial manipulation was reaching out, potentially providing the documentation I would need to establish Nathan's actions as unauthorized. I considered my response carefully. Appearing too eager might raise suspicions about my intentions. Seeming disinterested might discourage further contact. The optimal approach would acknowledge the value while maintaining professional distance. Interesting. More complete documentation would be necessary for any meaningful discussion. The response came swiftly. Complete records available tomorrow, including communications about timing specifically during your board meeting. 10 a.m. The bench. As the car pulled into the private executive entrance of Meridian Tower, I made my decision. The meeting warranted attention, though with appropriate precautions and verification protocols. I would not go alone, despite the instruction. Financial expertise had taught me that unilateral action based on partial information rarely yielded optimal results. Will consider? No commitments. My deliberately non-committal response would preserve flexibility while neither confirming nor denying my intentions. As I stepped from the car into the secure entrance vestibule, I nodded my thanks to the driver and slipped my phone into my coat pocket, mind already shifting to next steps. The executive elevator required both keycard and biometric confirmation, standard security for the financial headquarters that managed billions in global transactions. As I ascended to the executive floor, I reflected on the events reshaping my personal and professional landscape with remarkable speed. 3 days ago, I had been CFO of Meridian Global and wife of Nathan Harrington, balancing the demands of corporate leadership with the increasingly distant marriage to a creative professional whose career I had supported for 12 years. Now, I stood in a transformed reality, still CFO but no longer wife, financially diminished but strategically mobilizing, watching from the periphery as Nathan and Melanie launched their venture with resources they had taken without consent during my professional obligations. The elevator doors opened to the hushed elegance of the executive floor, all muted lighting, subtle art installations, and the understated luxury that conveyed financial stability without ostentation. The security guard at the central desk nodded respectfully as I passed, accustomed to executives keeping irregular hours during critical financial periods. "Evening, Ms. Harrington? Working late again?" "Just picking up some materials, Howard," I replied. "Though I may be in early tomorrow as well." "I'll make sure there's fresh coffee in the executive lounge," he offered, the small courtesy reflecting the culture of support Meridian provided its leadership team. My office suite occupied the northeast corner of the building, offering panoramic views of both the financial district and the riverside that gave our city its distinctive character. The apartment connected to my office through a private door, a feature initially designed as a recruitment incentive but which had become increasingly valuable as global market complexities demanded round-the-clock availability for senior executives managing international portfolios. As I entered my office, the automated systems responded to my presence, lights rising to their preferred evening setting, temperature adjusting slightly for comfort, the subtle background hum of the building's systems providing acoustic privacy. I moved directly to my desk, where the secure terminal would give me access to the resources I needed for the next phase of my response. Before focusing on the anonymous message, I needed to document the events of the past 3 days with meticulous precision. Opening my secure personal server, isolated from Meridian's corporate systems to maintain appropriate boundaries between personal and professional matters, I began constructing a comprehensive timeline. Tuesday, 2:30 p.m. Board meeting presentation. Begins Tuesday, 2:42 p.m. Transfer initiated from joint account while I am presenting Tuesday, 4:15 p.m. Board meeting concludes Tuesday, 4:20 p.m. I discover multiple bank notifications Tuesday, 4:25 p.m. Call to bank confirms transfers totaling $267,894. 32 to Melanie Westbrook. Tuesday, 4:45 p.m. Text from Nathan about celebrating new venture Tuesday, 5:10 p.m. Discovery of business announcement about Westbrook and Harrington creative launch. The chronology continued through today's events, including specific observations from the launch party, Morrison's investment announcement, statements Nathan had made about the divorce timeline, claims regarding their innovative funding approach, and key interactions with industry figures like Thomas Brennan and Patricia Alvarez. I supplemented the timeline with financial details I had gathered throughout the evening: approximate costs for the Metropolitan venue rental, estimated catering expenses, custom furniture and display technology investments, marketing materials production, and staffing requirements. A conservative estimate placed their launch expenses alone at nearly $85,000. Substantial for a new creative agency, particularly when combined with their announced office lease in the Tower District and hiring plans. By documenting these details, immediately, I was creating a contemporaneous record that would carry greater weight than retrospective accounts should legal proceedings become necessary. The financial professional in me recognized the value of meticulous documentation, not merely for potential litigation, but for my own strategic planning. As I completed the initial chronology, my phone chimed with another message from the anonymous number. One more thing you should know before tomorrow. Nathan adjusted transfer timing specifically to align with your board presentation. Not coincidence. Deliberate choice to ensure you couldn't intervene immediately. Have documentation of this planning. The new information sent a chill through me despite the controlled temperature of my office. The implication shifted Nathan's actions from opportunistic exploitation to calculated sabotage, timing the transfers precisely when my professional obligations would prevent immediate response, deliberately undermining both my financial security and potential reaction capacity simultaneously. This wasn't merely taking advantage of a joint account. This was strategic financial manipulation explicitly designed to maximize damage while minimizing my ability to intervene. Rather than responding immediately, I set the phone aside and turned my attention to the secure financial terminal. If I was meeting a potential informant tomorrow, regardless of their legitimacy, I needed to enter that interaction with complete command of available facts. First, I accessed the complete transaction history for our joint accounts, downloading the records for the past 6 months to establish patterns and deviations. The analysis confirmed what I already knew: regular deposits from both our incomes, consistent withdrawals for household expenses and investments, occasional larger transactions for planned purposes like property taxes or insurance premiums, all following expected patterns until Tuesday's anomalous transfers. Next, I reviewed our investment holdings, brokerage accounts, retirement funds, and property assets. Most remained intact, likely because they required more complex authorization protocols than the simple joint savings account Nathan had targeted. Our primary investment portfolio required dual authentication for significant withdrawals, a security measure I had insisted upon when we consolidated our long-term financial planning. While examining these accounts, I discovered something puzzling. A series of smaller withdrawals from Nathan's personal checking account over the previous 3 months, typically $9,500 each, just below the $10,000 threshold that would trigger automatic reporting requirements in the banking system. These transactions had begun shortly after Melanie joined Carson Media as marketing director, suggesting their relationship, and potentially their business planning, had been developing. Well before Nathan's departure announcement, the pattern suggested deliberate financial preparation, establishing resources outside our joint holdings, carefully structured to avoid detection or reporting. This wasn't impulsive action, but calculated extraction. The discovery reinforced my growing certainty. The anonymous message likely came from someone with legitimate access to financial documentation, someone who had observed patterns I was only now discovering. As I continued my analysis, an incoming email notification appeared on my screen. From James Morrison, sent just 20 minutes ago, well after midnight. Subject: Interesting meeting you at Westbrook and Harrington launch, Ms. Harrington, our brief. Conversation this evening left me with several questions regarding creative industry investment structures. While my team has performed standard due diligence on our investment in Westbrook and Harrington Creative, your comments suggested potential considerations we may not have fully explored. If you're amenable, I'd appreciate a more detailed discussion. Perhaps lunch next week? My assistant can coordinate with yours for timing. Particularly interested in your perspective on capitalization verification for creative startups and appropriate documentation standards for initial funding sources. Regards, James Morrison. Morrison Development. The email represented a significant development, Morrison himself expressing concerns about Westbrook and Harrington's financial foundation, reaching out directly rather than through intermediaries. My carefully phrased comments at the launch party had evidently registered more deeply than I'd anticipated, prompting the billionaire investor to seek verification outside Nathan and Melanie's carefully constructed narrative. I saved the email, without responding immediately, adding it to my documentation timeline. Morrison's interest created another potential pressure point, one that might prove valuable in the coming confrontation with Nathan. As I continued gathering information, a notification appeared from my building's security system. Someone had requested access to the executive floor at nearly 1 a.m. The security protocol routed the request to my phone, displaying the visitor's identification. Thomas Brennan. The venture capitalist's appearance at this hour was unexpected, to say the least. I activated the communication system. Mr. Brennan, this is a surprising time for a visit. His voice came through clearly, professional despite the unusual hour. Ms. Harrington, I apologize for the timing. After our conversation this evening, I conducted some preliminary research that revealed information I believe warrants immediate attention. Given the sensitivity of the matter, I preferred direct communication rather than electronic channels. His caution made sense from a security perspective, though the urgency suggested information of significant relevance to my situation. After brief consideration, I authorized access, instructing security to escort him to the executive conference room adjacent to my office rather than my private space, maintaining appropriate professional boundaries while acknowledging the potential value of his information. As I awaited his arrival, I glanced again at the mysterious text messages, the email from Morrison, and my detailed financial analysis. Whatever path forward emerged from these developing threads, one thing was becoming increasingly clear. Nathan's carefully orchestrated triumph was built on a far more vulnerable foundation than he realized. And foundations, as any financial architect knew, determined whether structures stood or collapsed under pressure. Thomas Brennan arrived precisely 7 minutes after his initial contact, escorted by Howard from security. Through the glass walls of the conference room, I observed his approach. Purposeful stride, leather portfolio tucked under one arm, expression suggesting focused determination rather than social courtesy. He had changed from his launch party attire into more casual business wear, indicating he had been working rather than socializing after the event. "Miss Harrington," he greeted me as Howard departed, closing the door behind him. "Thank you for seeing me at this unusual hour." "Unusual circumstances sometimes require unconventional timing," I replied, gesturing toward the chair across from me at the conference table. "Though I admit I'm curious about what couldn't wait until more traditional business hours." Brennan placed his portfolio on the table and took the offered seat, his movements deliberate and economical. Up close, I noted details that had been less apparent during our interactions at the party. The precision of his tailoring suggesting quiet wealth rather than ostentatious display. The slight lines around his eyes indicating long experience. In financial assessment, the careful way he organized his thoughts before speaking, that marked a disciplined analytical mind. After our conversation this evening, I conducted some preliminary research into Westbrook and Harrington's capitalization. He began, his tone matter-of-fact. "My firm regularly evaluates creative industry ventures for potential investment, so we maintain substantial databases tracking business formations, capital flows, and partnership structures within the sector." He opened his portfolio and removed a slim folder, though he didn't immediately share its contents. "What I discovered raised several red flags that I believe warrant immediate attention, particularly given your apparent personal connection to the situation." "What kind of red flags?" I asked, maintaining my professional composure despite the late hour and emotional complexity of the topic. "First, the timeline inconsistencies," Brennan replied. "Westbrook and Harrington Creative was registered as a business entity only 19 days ago. Yet, they've secured office space in the Tower District, completed extensive branding work, hired staff, and launched with an event at the Metropolitan, all requiring substantial capital deployment in an extremely compressed time frame." I nodded, having noted the same anomalies in my own analysis. "Rapid execution can indicate either exceptional preparation or concerning shortcuts." "Precisely," Brennan agreed. "In evaluating startup ventures, we typically look for methodical deployment of capital, strategic allocation that builds sustainable infrastructure. What we're seeing with Westbrook and Harrington resembles something quite different, an almost desperate attempt to establish immediate market presence, regardless of cost efficiency." He opened the folder and turned it so I could see its contents, a series of business filings, property lease registrations, and vendor contracts, all obtained through his firm's access to commercial databases. Their Tower District lease was signed 17 days ago, a 5-year commitment at premium rates with minimal negotiation. They paid an extraordinary security deposit, triple the standard rate, to secure immediate occupancy without the usual financial verification process. The pattern aligned with what I was discovering in my own investigation: rapid deployment of capital without the standard protections or negotiations that characterized sustainable business planning. "More concerning is this," Brennan continued, turning to the next document. 4 separate wire transfers to various vendors within a 48-hour period, all originating from a personal account rather than a properly structured business account with appropriate separation between personal and commercial assets. He looked up from the documents, meeting my gaze directly. "In venture evaluation, we consider such patterns significant risk indicators, suggesting either inexperience with proper business formation or, more troublingly, an attempt to establish operations before potential complications might arise." "Complications such as disputed funding sources," I suggested, watching his reaction carefully. Brennan nodded, his expression confirming he had already reached similar conclusions. "Ms. Harrington, my firm has no interest in involving itself in personal disputes. However, when we observe business formations that exhibit these particular patterns, We have a professional responsibility to consider whether the Capital Foundation meets basic ethical and legal standards. His careful phrasing acknowledged the sensitivity of the situation while establishing his own perspective as primarily professional rather than personal, a boundary I appreciated given the circumstances. "I understand your position," I replied, "though I'm curious what prompted you to bring this information directly to me, particularly at this hour." Brennan hesitated briefly, seemingly weighing his next words with particular care. "This afternoon, before the launch event, I received a confidential inquiry from James Morrison's investment team, seeking additional perspective on Westbrook and Harrington's market positioning and growth potential. Standard practice when evaluating creative industry investments. This new information explained Morrison's subsequent email to me. He was clearly conducting parallel verification through multiple channels, suggesting more thorough due diligence than Nathan had likely anticipated. I provided my professional assessment based on available market intelligence, Brennan continued. However, after our conversation at the event and my subsequent research this evening, I felt ethically obligated to contact Morrison's team with updated concerns regarding their capitalization structure. He paused, measuring my reaction. Approximately 40 minutes ago, I received a call from Morrison himself, expressing serious concerns about potential financial irregularities. He mentioned your name specifically, noting that your comments had prompted him to initiate additional verification procedures. The timeline was accelerating more rapidly than I had anticipated. Morrison's direct involvement, reaching out to both Brennan and me independently on the same evening, suggested the foundation of Nathan and Melanie's carefully orchestrated triumph was already beginning to fracture. Morrison indicated he's considering freezing his investment pending full verification of their capital sources, Brennan added, which brings me to the primary reason for my visit tonight. He removed a final document from his portfolio, what appeared to be a bank statement, though not from any standard consumer banking institution. This is a record from Geneva Trust Private Banking, documenting a series of structured transfers that occurred 3 days ago. My firm maintains monitoring relationships with several international financial institutions as part of our due diligence protocols for potential investments. He slid the document across the table, his expression grave. The transfer patterns align precisely with the capital deployment we're observing in Westbrook and Harrington's launch activities. I examined the document carefully, immediately recognizing the significance of what I was seeing. The records showed multiple incoming transfers to a newly established account, followed by outgoing transfers to various business entities associated with creative services, event management, and property leasing, all precisely matching the activities supporting Westbrook and Harrington's launch. Most significantly, the incoming transfers totaled exactly $267,894. 32. The amount withdrawn from our joint savings account during my board meeting. "How did you obtain these records?" I asked, my professional training automatically questioning. Document provenance before forming conclusions. Geneva Trust is a specialized financial institution that serves as intermediary for various investment structures my firm evaluates, Brennan explained. We maintain privileged access to certain transaction categories as part of our due diligence protocols. When patterns match specific monitoring parameters, our systems flag them for review. The explanation was plausible given Brennan's position. In venture capital, though it suggested his firm operated with unusually sophisticated financial intelligence capabilities, perhaps explaining his rapid identification of the anomalies in Westbrook and Harrington's formation. The timing of these transfers, occurring during your board meeting, as you mentioned earlier this evening, combined with the precise amount and subsequent deployment patterns, creates a compelling narrative, Brennan observed. One that contrasts significantly with the funding story being presented publicly by Mr. Harrington and Ms. Westbrook. His careful phrasing acknowledged the implications without requiring me to confirm or deny my personal connection to the situation. A professional Courtesy that respected boundaries while still addressing the central issue. "What do you intend to do with this information?" I asked, maintaining my composed exterior despite the significant implications of what he had shared. "That depends partly on you, Ms. Harrington," Brennan replied, his tone suggesting careful consideration rather than pressure. "My professional obligation is to provide accurate investment intelligence to clients like Morrison who rely on our assessments. However, there are multiple ways to address potential financial irregularities, ranging from formal regulatory reports to more discreet interventions." The implication was clear. He was offering a potential alliance, combining his financial intelligence resources with my personal knowledge to address Nathan's actions through carefully calibrated pressure rather than immediate legal escalation. "Before making any decisions, I should mention one additional development," Brennan added. "Morrison has scheduled an emergency meeting with Westbrook and Harrington tomorrow morning at 9 a.m. to discuss capitalization verification requirements. He's specifically requested financial documentation tracing the source of their initial funding." This information aligned with the anonymous text I had received, suggesting tomorrow would become a critical inflection point in the developing situation. Nathan and Melanie would face direct questioning about their funding sources from their primary investor, creating potential leverage I hadn't anticipated developing so quickly. "Thank you for bringing this to my attention," I said, carefully, neutral in my response. "The information provides valuable context for certain decisions I'm currently evaluating." Brennan nodded, understanding my measured reaction. I should clarify that my interest in this situation is not merely professional. Courtesy. My firm had considered Nathan Harrington for a potential creative director position approximately 6 months ago. During our evaluation process, we identified concerning patterns in his financial management approach that ultimately led us to pursue other candidates. This revelation added another layer to Brennan's involvement, suggesting his awareness of Nathan's tendencies predated the current situation. "What kind of patterns?" I asked, professionally curious despite the personal implications. "Primarily an inconsistency between his creative brilliance and his financial judgment," Brennan explained. "His portfolio demonstrated exceptional creative vision, but our background assessment revealed multiple instances of questionable financial decisions, using client advances to cover personal expenses, commingling project funds, structuring compensation in ways that prioritized immediate gratification over sustainable growth." The description aligned with behaviors I had observed throughout our marriage: Nathan's tendency to view financial resources as tools for creative execution rather than assets requiring careful stewardship. I had attributed these tendencies to the natural tension between creative and financial perspectives, compensating through my own careful management of our shared resources. Now I recognized that what I had interpreted as complementary differences might have been more fundamental character indicators, patterns that others like Brennan had identified as professional red flags. "None of these observations constituted legal violations," Brennan continued, "but collectively they suggested a professional who prioritized creative achievement over financial integrity, a concerning combination in leadership positions." "I appreciate your candor," I replied, carefully maintaining my professional boundaries despite the personal relevance of his observations. "And your discretion in bringing this information directly to me rather than distributing it more broadly." Brennan gathered his documents, returning them to his portfolio with the same precision that characterized his analysis. "Financial integrity matters to those of us who build careers on trust and verification, Ms. Harrington. When we observe potential violations of that integrity, we have a professional responsibility to address them, particularly when they might impact reputable investors like Morrison." As he prepared to depart, he placed a business card on the table between us, different from the one he had offered earlier, this one containing only a direct mobile number rather than his firm's contact information. Should you decide to address this situation in a structured manner that protects legitimate financial interests while minimizing unnecessary public complications, I'm available to discuss potential approaches. My firm has considerable experience in financial recovery strategies that prioritize resolution over punishment. The offer was carefully calibrated, professional assistance rather than personal involvement, focused on financial recovery rather than emotional retribution. "I'll keep that in mind," I said, rising as he did, "though I haven't yet determined my preferred approach to this situation." "Of course," Brennan acknowledged, "though based on Morrison's timeline, certain options may have limited availability after tomorrow morning's meeting." As Howard arrived to escort him back to the building exit, Brennan paused at the conference room door. "One final observation, if I may. In my experience evaluating hundreds of business ventures, I've found that those built on misappropriated resources rarely achieve sustainable success, regardless of their creative potential. The foundation matters more than most creative professionals realize." With that parting insight, he departed, leaving me alone with the implications of what he had shared and the decisions that now required immediate attention. The conference room felt suddenly quiet, the muted hum of building systems providing acoustic privacy for the thoughts now racing through my analytical mind. Brennan's information had accelerated my understanding of both Nathan's actions and the potential leverage points available for response. Morrison's meeting tomorrow morning created an immediate timeline, a moment when Nathan and Melanie would face direct questioning about their funding sources, potentially exposing the unauthorized transfers if they failed to produce convincing documentation of legitimate capitalization. The anonymous text message suggesting a 10 a.m. meeting at Riverside Park now seemed potentially connected to these developments, perhaps someone from Morrison's team offering additional intelligence after the verification meeting. As I returned to my office, the city lights visible through the panoramic windows, I considered my options with the disciplined analysis that had built my financial career. The situation had evolved from personal betrayal to potential financial fraud, with implications for multiple stakeholders: Morrison's investment, Pinnacle's client relationship, the employees Nathan and Melanie had already hired based on their apparent financial stability. The path forward would require careful calibration, addressing the unauthorized transfers while maintaining my professional reputation and minimizing collateral damage to innocent parties. Nathan had created this situation through his actions during my board meeting, but the resolution would be shaped by my decisions in the hours ahead. I turned back to my secure terminal, the chronology I had been building now supplemented by Brennan's additional intelligence. Whatever approach I selected, it would be based on complete information and strategic consideration rather than emotional reaction, exactly the disciplined analysis that Nathan had consistently underestimated throughout our marriage. As the first hints of dawn began to lighten the eastern sky beyond the city's skyline, I finalized my strategic approach for the coming day. Not a plan for revenge, but a carefully structured response that would address the unauthorized transfers while preserving my professional standing and financial security. Nathan believed he had executed a flawless transition from our marriage to his new venture with Melanie. Tomorrow would reveal how profoundly he had miscalculated both the consequences of his actions and my capacity to respond effectively. Dawn broke over the city with the muted golden light of early autumn, filtering through the floor-to-ceiling windows of my office and transforming the polished surfaces from their nighttime shadows into planes of warm illumination. I had remained at Meridian Tower through the night, alternating between strategic planning and brief periods of rest on the sofa in my executive apartment, a practical approach that kept me focused on the tasks at hand rather than returning to the empty townhouse filled with reminders of Nathan's betrayal. The quiet hours had been productive. I had compiled comprehensive documentation of the unauthorized transfers, constructed a detailed timeline of Nathan and Melanie's business formation activities, and prepared 2 distinct response strategies depending on how events unfolded at Morrison's verification meeting. Now, with several hours remaining before any direct action would be required, I allowed myself a moment of reflection on the path that had led to this inflection point. I moved to the eastern windows, watching the sun rise over the financial district where I had built my career while simultaneously supporting Nathan's creative ambitions. 12 years of partnership, professional, financial, emotional, dissolved by calculated betrayal during my board presentation. The symmetry was painful, yet illuminating. While I had been demonstrating my financial stewardship to Meridian's leadership, Nathan had been systematically dismantling our shared financial foundation. My executive assistant, Diana, arrived precisely at 6:30 a.m., unsurprised to find me already working. Over 8 years of supporting my role at Meridian, she had become accustomed to my intensive work patterns during critical financial periods. "Good morning," she greeted me, setting a fresh cup of coffee on my desk, prepared exactly as I preferred without requiring instruction. "I see we're operating in crisis mode. What do you need?" Diana's directness was one of her most valuable qualities. She didn't waste time with unnecessary pleasantries when the situation clearly required focused action. "Two pressing matters," I replied, appreciating her efficiency. "First, James Morrison has requested a lunch meeting next week to discuss creative industry investment strategies. Please coordinate with his office for timing, but ensure it doesn't conflict with the Asian markets call on Wednesday." She nodded, making a note in her tablet. "And the second matter? I need comprehensive background research on Melanie Westbrook, professional, history, financial standing, previous business relationships, particularly any connection to financial institutions or banking operations." Diana's expression remained professionally neutral, though I detected a flicker of recognition regarding the potential personal implications of the request. To her credit, she maintained our established boundary between professional support and personal involvement. "Timeline for the research?" she asked simply. "As soon as possible. Prioritize professional affiliations and financial connections over personal background. I'll have preliminary information within 2 hours," she confirmed. "Anything else for immediate attention?" I considered the developing situation carefully. "Yes. Please contact our outside counsel at Hargrove and Mitchell. I'll need a brief consultation regarding financial recovery options for unauthorized transfers from joint accounts, preferable before 9 a.m. if possible." Diana nodded, making another note. "I'll make the arrangements immediately. Should I hold all routine matters until further notice?" "Yes, except for the quarterly compliance certification. That deadline remains non-negotiable regardless of other developments." With that direction provided, Diana withdrew to her adjacent office, already initiating the requested actions with her characteristic efficiency. Her capacity to execute complex tasks without requiring extensive explanation represented exactly the kind of professional support that had enabled my advancement at Meridian. Competent, discreet, and focused on results rather than process. As Diana managed these immediate tasks, I returned to my reflection on the situation's evolution. Nathan had consistently underestimated my financial capabilities throughout our marriage, viewing my professional expertise as somehow separate from our personal financial management, a compartmentalization that had ultimately enabled his miscalculation regarding the consequences of his actions. My phone signaled an incoming text from the same anonymous number that had contacted me last night. "Morrison meeting with WH Creative, moved to 8:30. Be at Riverside Park by 9:15 for immediate update. Critical documentation available." The accelerated timeline suggested increasing pressure on Nathan and Melanie's narrative. Morrison moving more aggressively than anticipated to verify their financial foundations. I still hadn't determined whether to attend the anonymous meeting, but the developing situation warranted continued monitoring of all potential intelligence sources. At 7:15 a.m., Diana returned with confirmation that Hargrove and Mitchell's senior partner specialized in financial recovery would be available for a secure video consultation at 8 a.m. She also provided the first elements of Melanie Westbrook's professional background, a comprehensive CV that revealed an interesting pattern in her career progression. She's moved through 5 agencies in 7 years, Diana noted, highlighting relevant sections. Each transition coincided with major client acquisitions at her new agency. The industry pattern suggests she may leverage existing client relationships during her transitions. The information created a more nuanced understanding of Melanie's professional approach, suggesting someone who strategically positioned herself at the intersection of valuable client relationships and agency transitions. Not necessarily unethical, but certainly calculated in her career management. Most interesting is this, Diana continued, pointing to a 6-month gap in Melanie's employment history approximately 3 years ago. During this period, she was listed as a financial systems consultant for Bradford Financial Services, a regional bank that was subsequently acquired by First Capital. The connection to the banking sector potentially explained how the transfers from our joint account had been structured so effectively. Melanie might possess inside knowledge of banking operations that facilitated the rapid movement and deployment of funds. First Capital, I noted. The same institution where the funds were transferred. Diana nodded, her expression remaining professionally neutral despite the obvious implications. Yes. The receiving account for the transfers from your joint savings was established at First Capital's private client division. The pattern was becoming clearer, not merely opportunistic betrayal, but carefully orchestrated financial extraction, potentially leveraging Melanie's banking connections to optimize execution. At precisely 8:01 a.m., my secure terminal signaled the incoming consultation with Hargrove and Mitchell. Eleanor Hargrove herself appeared on the screen, the firm's founding partner and a recognized authority on financial recovery strategies. Her presence, rather than a junior associate, indicated that Diana had effectively communicated the significance of my consultation request. Alexandra? Eleanor greeted me, her expression suggesting focused attention rather than social courtesy. Diana indicated this concerns unauthorized transfers from joint accounts with time-sensitive implications. Correct, I confirmed, appreciating her directness. I need to understand my options regarding funds transferred without consent from a joint marital account during divorce proceedings, specifically $267,894. 32 transferred 3 days ago during my board meeting. Eleanor's expression remained professionally neutral, though I detected a slight narrowing of her eyes at the specific details. Joint accounts present certain challenges. Regarding transfer authorization, as I'm sure you're aware, both parties typically have equal rights to access and utilize the funds, absent specific court orders during divorce proceedings. I understand the general principle, I acknowledged. However, these specific circumstances involve transfers, deliberately timed to occur during my board meeting when I could not reasonably monitor or respond to account notifications. Additionally, the funds were immediately deployed for business formation activities that excluded me despite being sourced from joint marital assets. Eleanor nodded thoughtfully. The timing element creates potential grounds for financial recovery under improper self-dealing provisions, particularly if you can demonstrate the transfers were deliberately structured to prevent your awareness or response. I have documentation confirming the transfers occurred precisely during my board presentation schedule, which was known to my husband in advance. That timing correlation helps establish intent, Eleanor confirmed. What's your preferred outcome in this situation? Full recovery of the transferred funds, partial recovery with negotiated settlement, or something else entirely? The question cut to the heart of my strategic considerations. While complete financial recovery represented the optimal financial outcome, the broader implications for my professional reputation and future arrangements required more nuanced consideration. My primary objective is establishing proper accountability for unauthorized utilization of joint assets, I replied carefully. The specific recovery structure is flexible, provided it appropriately addresses both the financial impact and the underlying breach of financial responsibility. Eleanor's expression suggested professional approval of my approach, focusing on principles and accountability rather than purely punitive objectives. Based on what you've described, you have several options, she outlined. First, immediate, injunctive relief freezing the business assets purchased with these funds until ownership can be properly adjudicated. Second, negotiated settlement requiring either return of the original funds or appropriate equity compensation in the business ventures they've funded. Third, formal legal proceedings for financial misconduct, which would likely involve regulatory authorities given the substantial amount involved. The options aligned with the strategic pathways I had been considering, though Eleanor's expertise provided additional validation and refinement of the potential approaches. What timeline would you recommend for intervention? I asked, prioritizing tactical execution over theoretical options. Given your description of ongoing business formation activities utilizing these funds, immediate action would be advisable, Eleanor responded. Assets are being encumbered, contracts established, and third-party obligations created, all potentially complicating recovery if not addressed promptly. Her assessment confirmed my analysis regarding the accelerating timeline. Nathan and Melanie were rapidly deploying the transferred funds across multiple business activities, creating increasingly complex entanglements that would make financial recovery progressively more challenging. I'm prepared to move forward today, I confirmed. What specific documentation would optimize our position? Eleanor outlined precise requirements, transaction records, communication evidence regarding timing, documentation of knowledge regarding my board meeting schedule, and verification of fund deployment for business activities that excluded my participation despite utilizing marital assets. As our consultation concluded, Eleanor provided one final observation. Alexandra, in my experience with financial recovery cases, the most effective resolutions often involve strategic leverage at moments when counterparties are particularly vulnerable to verification requirements. If your husband has utilized these funds to secure investment or client relationships based on misrepresentations regarding their source, that creates a potential inflection point for negotiated resolution. Her insight aligned perfectly with the developing situation involving Morrison's verification meeting scheduled for 8:30 a.m., creating exactly the leverage point she had described. After the consultation ended, I reviewed the comprehensive strategy I had developed overnight, now refined with Eleanor's expert input and Diana's research regarding Melanie's banking connections. The approach balanced multiple objectives: financial, recovery, professional reputation management, and appropriate accountability for Nathan's actions, while maintaining the disciplined focus that had characterized my career. Diana returned with additional research findings as I completed my strategic review. I've identified something potentially significant, she reported. Melanie Westbrook's former supervisor at Bradford Financial was Thomas Carlson, currently head of private banking at Geneva Trust. The connection completed another piece of the puzzle, explaining how the transferred funds had moved through the Geneva Trust accounts Brennan had identified in his documentation. Not merely opportunistic betrayal, but a carefully structured financial extraction utilizing Melanie's professional network to optimize execution. As 8:30 a.m. approached, the time of Morrison's verification meeting with Nathan and Melanie, I prepared for the next phase of my response. Whether I decided to meet the anonymous source at Riverside Park or pursue other intervention approaches, the coming hours would determine how this situation evolved from betrayal to accountability. My phone vibrated with an incoming call from an unlisted number. Answering, I heard the carefully measured voice of James Morrison himself. Ms. Harrington, my apologies for the early call. I believe we have a mutual interest in discussing certain financial arrangements before my meeting with Westbrook and Harrington Creative this morning. The direct contact from Morrison, bypassing assistance and scheduling protocols, indicated The situation was accelerating even more rapidly than I had anticipated. "I'm available immediately," I confirmed, recognizing the strategic value of this unexpected development. "Excellent," Morrison replied. "My car is currently approaching Meridian Tower. Could you join me for a brief conversation before my verification meeting with Mr. Harrington and Ms. Westbrook?" The invitation created an unexpected opportunity to shape Morrison's understanding before his direct engagement with Nathan and Melanie, potentially the most effective leverage point yet in addressing the unauthorized transfers. "I'll meet you in the executive lobby in 5 minutes," I confirmed. As I gathered the essential documentation for this impromptu meeting, I reflected on how dramatically circumstances had evolved in just 3 days. From discovering the unauthorized transfers during my board meeting to now potentially influencing a billionaire investor's approach to verification requirements. Nathan had calculated that I would be too professionally constrained, too emotionally devastated, or too concerned with appearances to respond effectively to his actions. He had fundamentally misjudged both my capabilities and my determination, a miscalculation that was about to have significant consequences for his carefully orchestrated transition. The path forward remained complex, requiring careful calibration of response rather than emotional reaction. But for the first time since discovering the transfers during my board presentation, I felt fully aligned with the disciplined strategic thinking that had built my career, applying financial expertise not just to corporate challenges but to addressing this profound personal and financial betrayal. As I prepared to meet Morrison, I knew that the coming hours would transform this situation from devastating revelation to structured resolution, guided not by vindictiveness, but by the same principles of accountability and financial integrity that had shaped my professional success. James Morrison's car, a stately black Mercedes with discreet tinted windows, idled at Meridian Tower's executive entrance as I emerged from the lobby. The driver opened the rear door with practiced efficiency, revealing Morrison in the spacious interior, dressed in a tailored charcoal suit that suggested business formality despite the early hour. He was alone, without the assistants or advisors that typically surrounded figures of his prominence, an intentional choice that indicated both the sensitivity and significance of our discussion. "Ms. Harrington," he greeted me as I joined him, his tone cordial but direct. "Thank you for accommodating this unconventional meeting request." "Circumstances occasionally require flexible approaches," I replied, settling into the supple leather seat opposite him as the driver closed the door, sealing us in the privacy of the vehicle's cabin. Morrison gestured to the driver through the partition, and the car pulled smoothly away from the curb, merging into the early morning traffic without any specific destination, simply providing a secure, mobile environment for our conversation. "I'll be direct," Morrison began, his expression reflecting the serious purpose behind this meeting. "Last night's launch event for Westbrook and Harrington Creative raised several questions regarding their capitalization structure, questions that became considerably more pointed following my conversations with both you and Thomas Brennan." He paused, studying my reaction with the careful assessment of someone accustomed to evaluating both financial propositions and the people behind them. "This morning, I received documentation suggesting potential irregularities in the funding source for their agency launch. Before my verification meeting with Mr. Harrington and Ms. Westbrook, I wanted to understand your perspective on the situation." The deliberate ambiguity of his reference to documentation suggested Morrison was testing my reaction rather than immediately revealing his specific information. As CFO of Meridian Global, I had navigated countless negotiations where information asymmetry created strategic advantages. This conversation would require the same careful calibration, providing sufficient clarity to advance my interests without overcommitting to specific narratives. "What specific aspects of their capitalization structure are you concerned about?" I asked, maintaining professional neutrality while redirecting the conversation toward his priorities, rather than immediately disclosing my own. Morrison nodded slightly, perhaps appreciating the disciplined approach. The primary concern involves the source of their initial funding, approximately $267,000 deployed across various launch activities within an unusually compressed timeframe. My team has identified potential inconsistencies between the narrative presented regarding these funds and certain transaction records that have come to our attention. The precise amount confirmed Morrison had access to detailed financial information regarding the transfers from our joint account, likely the same documentation Brennan had referenced during our late-night meeting. The situation was developing, exactly as Eleanor Hargrove had suggested, a strategic leverage point created by verification requirements from a significant stakeholder. Those concerns appear well-founded, I confirmed, making a calculated decision to provide direct acknowledgement, rather than continued professional deflection. The funds in question were transferred from a joint marital account without my knowledge or consent during my board presentation 3 days ago. The timing was not coincidental. Morrison's expression remained composed, though I detected a subtle tightening around his eyes, recognition of the implications without revealing his immediate reaction. You're alleging unauthorized appropriation of joint assets rather than legitimate business capitalization. I have comprehensive documentation confirming both the unauthorized nature of the transfers and their deliberate timing to prevent my immediate awareness or intervention, I replied, opening my portfolio to reference, but not yet share, the materials I had prepared. This creates a complicated situation regarding my investment position, Morrison observed, his tone suggesting analytical assessment rather than emotional response. Beyond the personal implications between you and Mr. Harrington, there are substantive concerns regarding proper disclosure during investment negotiations. The observation aligned perfectly with my strategic objectives, shifting the focus from personal grievance to professional standards and investment integrity. Morrison's primary concern would naturally center on his potential financial and reputational exposure, rather than the personal dimensions of Nathan's betrayal. Proper disclosure represents the foundation of investment integrity, I agreed. When capital sources involve disputed funds or potential financial impropriety, all subsequent business activities become vulnerable to challenge, creating significant risks for associated investors and clients. Morrison nodded thoughtfully. My verification meeting was scheduled specifically to address these emergent concerns. However, your direct confirmation of unauthorized transfers creates a more fundamental issue regarding the viability of my investment position. May I ask what sparked your initial verification concerns? I inquired, seeking to understand the full context of his awareness before determining my next approach. Several factors converged, Morrison explained. Your comments at the launch event prompted initial questions. Thomas Brennan's subsequent contact regarding potential financial irregularities heightened those concerns. This morning, I received anonymous documentation detailing the specific transfers from your joint account, including timestamps correlating precisely with your board meeting schedule. The reference to anonymous documentation confirmed the expanding awareness of Nathan's actions, information flowing through multiple channels as the carefully constructed narrative of Westbrook and Harrington's launch began to unravel under scrutiny. What outcome are you seeking from this situation, Ms. Harrington? Morrison asked directly. Financial recovery? Punitive consequences? Or something else entirely? The question reflected the same essential calculus Eleanor Hargrove had prompted me to consider, defining my primary objectives beyond emotional reaction to betrayal. Morrison was evaluating whether my approach might align with his interests in resolving the situation efficiently, while minimizing potential damage to his investment position and reputation. My primary concern is appropriate accountability for unauthorized utilization of joint assets, I replied, echoing my earlier response to Eleanor while tailoring it to Morrison's perspective. The specific mechanism for that accountability remains flexible, provided it properly addresses both the financial impact and the underlying breach of financial responsibility. Morrison studied me with renewed interest, perhaps recognizing the disciplined approach that separated my response from emotionally driven reactions more common in personal financial disputes. That perspective suggests potential for structured resolution rather than escalated conflict. Structured approaches generally yield superior outcomes when multiple stakeholders are involved, I agreed. Your investment position, Pinnacle Developments, client relationship, and the employees hired by Westbrook and Harrington all represent legitimate interests separate from the unauthorized transfers themselves. My acknowledgement of these broader implications appeared to resonate with Morrison's pragmatic business perspective. What specific resolution would you consider appropriate under these circumstances? The question created an opening for the strategic approach I had been developing overnight, a calibrated response that would address the unauthorized transfers while maintaining my professional standing and financial security. A comprehensive resolution would require 3 core elements, I outlined. First, proper financial accounting and recovery regarding the unauthorized transfers. Second, appropriate disclosure to affected parties regarding the actual funding circumstances. Third, structured arrangements that allow legitimate business activities to continue without being compromised by the foundational financial impropriety. Morrison nodded, his expression suggesting professional respect for the balanced approach. Those parameters align with standard investment recovery protocols in situations involving disputed capital sources. The challenge lies in implementation, given the public launch and established client relationships. Implementation challenges often determine whether resolution becomes constructive or merely punitive, I observed. My interest lies in addressing the financial breach rather than unnecessarily disrupting legitimate business activities. This framing positioned my approach as principled yet practical, focused on accountability without vindictiveness. For someone like Morrison, whose business empire had been built on pragmatic resolution of complex situations, this perspective would likely resonate more effectively than emotional demands for justice. I appreciate your measured approach, Morrison said after a moment of consideration. Many individuals would adopt more adversarial positions when facing similar circumstances. Adversarial approaches rarely optimize outcomes when multiple stakeholders are involved, I replied. Financial resolution requires precision rather than emotion. The car had been circling the financial district during our conversation, providing both privacy and movement without specific destination. Now Morrison glanced at his watch, a subtle gesture indicating transition to next steps rather than conclusion. My verification meeting with Harrington and Westbrook begins in 20 minutes, he noted. Based on our conversation, I believe we have aligned interests regarding appropriate disclosure and accountability, though potentially different perspectives on implementation. Aligned interests often permit flexible implementation approaches, I agreed, recognizing the potential for collaborative resolution rather than competing objectives. Morrison considered this for a moment, then made a decision. Would you be willing to join the verification meeting? Your direct participation would create immediate accountability while potentially facilitating more efficient resolution than prolonged disputes through intermediaries. The invitation represented an unexpected acceleration of the timeline, creating immediate confrontation rather than the more gradual pressure I had been preparing. Direct participation would significantly alter the dynamic, transforming verification questions into accountability demands in Nathan and Melanie's perception. That approach would certainly expedite resolution, I acknowledged, carefully weighing the strategic implications. Though it might create heightened emotional dynamics that could complicate rational discussion of financial arrangements. Morrison nodded understanding. Emotional complications seem inevitable given the circumstances. However, direct engagement often resolves situations more efficiently than prolonged uncertainty. My experience suggests addressing foundational issues immediately, rather than allowing narratives to solidify around misrepresentations. His perspective aligned with financial recovery best practices, early intervention preventing further entanglement of disputed resources within expanding business activities. The direct approach would certainly create immediate accountability, though potentially at the cost of more measured negotiation. What specific role would you envision for me in this meeting? I asked, evaluating the practical implementation, rather than merely the conceptual approach. Observer initially, Morrison replied. I would begin with standard verification questions regarding their capitalization structure. Their responses would determine whether and when your direct participation becomes appropriate. The objective would be establishing factual context, rather than creating confrontational dynamics. The proposed structure offered reasonable balance, creating accountability without immediately escalating to direct confrontation. It would allow Nathan and Melanie's own responses to determine the subsequent course of the meeting, rather than beginning with accusations. That approach seems appropriate given the circumstances, I agreed, after careful consideration. Though, I would want to ensure the discussion remains focused on financial accountability, rather than personal grievances. Absolutely, Morrison confirmed. My interest is strictly limited to investment integrity and proper financial disclosure. Personal matters beyond those parameters remain outside the scope of our discussion. This boundary setting provided appropriate professional context for my participation, focused on financial verification, rather than relationship dynamics or emotional consequences. It aligned with my strategic objective of addressing the unauthorized transfers through established financial accountability mechanisms rather than personal confrontation. In that case, I'm willing to participate as you've outlined, I confirmed. Morrison nodded with evident satisfaction. Excellent. My driver will take us directly to the Westbrook and Harrington offices in the Tower District. They're expecting me for what they believe is a standard investment verification meeting, a routine discussion of capitalization documentation and funding source verification. As the car changed direction toward the Tower District, I reflected on how dramatically circumstances had evolved from my initial discovery of the unauthorized transfers. What Nathan had likely anticipated as a unilateral financial action during my board meeting had transformed into a multi-stakeholder accountability situation involving a billionaire investor with significant influence over his agency's future. The path forward remained complex and uncertain. Nathan and Melanie's reactions to direct questioning about their funding sources would determine whether resolution proceeded through negotiated settlement or escalated to formal legal proceedings. But regardless of their response, the carefully constructed narrative of triumphant transition they had presented at last night's launch party was about to encounter the reality of financial accountability. As we approached the Tower District, with its gleaming high-rises and premium commercial spaces, I maintained my professional composure, while internally acknowledging the significance of this moment. Within the hour, Nathan would face direct consequences for his calculated betrayal, not through emotional confrontation, but through the precise financial accountability mechanisms he had likely believed he could evade during our marital dissolution. The symmetry contained its own form of justice. Just as he had acted during my board presentation, a moment of professional significance he had deliberately targeted, I would now participate in his verification meeting, creating accountability, during what he had anticipated would be a moment of professional validation. Not revenge, but appropriate consequence, delivered not through emotional outbursts, but through the same disciplined financial approaches that had built my career. The approach reflected not just professional training, but fundamental character, addressing betrayal with integrity rather than matching deception with further manipulation. As Morrison's car pulled into the exclusive parking area beneath the Tower District's premier building, I prepared for the next phase of this evolving situation, focused not on emotional satisfaction, but on proper financial resolution that would address the unauthorized transfers while maintaining my professional standards and personal dignity. The Tower District's premier building embodied architectural prestige, soaring glass and steel with a distinctive angular profile that dominated the skyline. As Morrison and I rode the private elevator reserved for executive access, I maintained my professional composure while mentally preparing for the unexpected confrontation ahead. The elevator opened directly into a sleek reception area bearing the freshly installed Westbrook and Harrington Creative logo, geometric letter forms in copper and navy that reflected the design aesthetic I recognized from their launch event. The receptionist's expression shifted from polite welcome to visible surprise as she registered my presence alongside Morrison. "Mr. Morrison, welcome. Mr. Harrington and Ms. Westbrook are prepared for your meeting in the main conference room." Her eyes flickered uncertainly to me. "I don't believe we were expecting additional participants." "Ms. Harrington will be joining our discussion," Morrison stated with the casual authority of someone unaccustomed to having his arrangements questioned. "Please inform Mr. Harrington and Ms. Westbrook that we've arrived." The receptionist hesitated momentarily before regaining her professional demeanor. "Of course, please follow me." As we moved through the open concept space, I noted the rapid transformation from empty commercial property to functioning agency, designer furniture arranged in collaborative clusters, state-of-the-art technology, installations, impressive client work already displayed on mounted screens. The accelerated deployment of resources was evident in every detail, from custom light fixtures to the specialized creative workstations positioned throughout the space. My resources, my savings, my financial security, repurposed without consent, to create this showcase of creative ambition and professional reinvention. The receptionist led us to a glass-walled conference room where Nathan and Melanie were reviewing documents spread across a polished conference table. Their expressions, as they looked up at our entrance, captured the entire spectrum of recognition, surprise, and calculation in rapid succession. Nathan recovered first, rising with the practiced networking smile I knew so well, though it failed to reach his eyes, which remained fixed on me with unmistakable alarm. "James, welcome," he greeted Morrison, then hesitated as he struggled to determine the appropriate acknowledgement of my presence. "Alexandra, this is unexpected." "Ms. Harrington will be joining our verification discussion," Morrison explained, his tone suggesting this was a routine business arrangement rather than the dramatic confrontation it represented. Given her financial expertise and specific knowledge regarding your capitalization structure, her perspective seemed valuable for our discussion. Melanie remained seated, her expression carefully controlled though her posture had visibly tensed. "How considerate," she commented, her tone maintaining professional courtesy while her eyes assessed me with new wariness. "Though this deviates from our expected meeting format. Verification processes occasionally require adaptive approaches," Morrison replied as he took a seat at the head of the conference table, "particularly when new information emerges regarding funding sources." I selected a seat opposite Nathan and Melanie, placing my portfolio on the table before me without immediately opening it, its presence a silent reminder of the documentation it contained. The physical positioning created natural confrontation, dynamics. Morrison at the head as the authority figure, Nathan and Melanie on one side representing their partnership, and me on the opposite side representing the questioning of their narrative. "Before we begin," Nathan said, attempting to regain control of the situation, "perhaps you could clarify the specific purpose of Alexandra's participation. Our understanding was that this meeting would focus on standard investment verification, protocols between Westbrook and Harrington and Morrison Development." His deliberate framing attempted to position me as an interloper in a business discussion rather than a directly affected stakeholder in the financial matters under examination. The strategy was familiar, using procedural objections to deflect substantive accountability, a tactic I had observed throughout his professional career. "That remains our focus," Morrison confirmed. "Ms. Harrington's participation relates directly to questions regarding your initial capitalization, specifically, The source of approximately $267,000 deployed across your launch activities. The precise figure hung in the air between us, an unmistakable reference to the exact amount transferred from our joint account. Nathan's expression remained composed, though I detected the slight muscle tension in his jaw that always betrayed his internal stress during challenging negotiations. Our initial capitalization came from various sources, Nathan replied carefully. Personal investment, advanced client retainers, and strategic partnership arrangements. Standard funding approaches for creative startups. The deliberate vagueness contrasted sharply with the precision of Morrison's reference, attempting to dilute the specific transfer amount within broader funding categories. It was a textbook deflection strategy, acknowledging the general topic while avoiding the specific accountability point. Perhaps we should be more precise, Morrison suggested, his tone remaining conversational, though his gaze had sharpened. My team has identified a series of transfers totaling exactly $267,194.32 that funded your initial operations. These transfers originated from a joint account held by you and Ms. Harrington, with the transactions occurring 3 days ago between 2:30 p.m. and 3:15 p.m. We're seeking verification regarding the authorization and disclosure protocols for these specific transfers. The clinical precision of Morrison's statement eliminated any possibility of continued vagueness. Nathan glanced briefly at Melanie before responding, their silent exchange suggesting they had not anticipated this level of specific knowledge regarding their funding source. The funds represent part of our divorce settlement, Nathan stated, pivoting to the same narrative he had presented at the launch party. Financial separations during marital dissolution are standard procedure. Interesting characterization, Morrison observed, particularly since no formal settlement had been established at the time of transfer, and the transactions occurred specifically during Ms. Harrington's board meeting presentation, timing that prevented immediate awareness or response. The direct acknowledgement of the timing correlation created visible tension in Nathan's composure. This was no longer a situation he could navigate through practiced networking charm or creative narrative construction. Morrison had specific, documented knowledge that contradicted his preferred framing. Timing convergences happen in business transitions, Nathan attempted, though his response sounded hollow even to my ears. Alexandra's schedule has always been filled with corporate obligations. Let's be entirely direct, Morrison suggested, his patient tone belied by the intensity of his gaze. Were these transfers specifically authorized by both account holders, or did you execute them unilaterally during Ms. Harrington's board presentation? The question eliminated all remaining space for deflection or recharacterization. Nathan's expression hardened as he recognized the futility of continued narrative management with someone possessing such specific documentation. Joint accounts provide equal access rights to both parties, he stated, shifting to a legal justification approach. Formal authorization protocols aren't typically required for transactions between marital partners, even during separation proceedings. Equal access rights differ significantly from proper financial disclosure during investment negotiations, Morrison countered. When seeking capital investment, standard protocols require transparent disclosure of all funding sources, particularly those involving potential legal disputes regarding authorization. Melanie, who had remained strategically silent during this exchange, apparently decided intervention was necessary as the conversation moved firmly into territory threatening their investment relationship. James, she began, using the familiar address to establish connection. Business formations during personal transitions often involve complex financial arrangements. We believed the capitalization details were appropriately communicated during our investment discussions, focusing on the operational deployment rather than the specific sourcing mechanics. Her attempt at redirection, shifting focus from authorization questions to operational outcomes, reflected skilled crisis management, but Morrison remained focused on the fundamental disclosure issue. Transparent sourcing represents a foundational element of investment integrity, he replied. Operational excellence cannot compensate for capitalization irregularities, particularly when those irregularities involve disputed marital assets. Throughout this exchange, I had maintained deliberate silence, allowing Morrison's verification process to establish the factual context before my direct participation. The approach had proven effective, as Nathan and Melanie's responses increasingly confirmed the unauthorized nature of the transfers without requiring my explicit allegations. Now, as the conversation reached the critical inflection point regarding proper disclosure and potential resolution, I determined direct engagement would advance the strategic objectives I had developed overnight. "If I may," I said, speaking for the first time since entering the conference room, "there appears to be a fundamental mischaracterization regarding these transfers. They were not part of any settlement agreement, formal or informal. They were executed unilaterally and without disclosure during a time when my professional obligations prevented immediate detection or response." Nathan's expression tightened. Further, as I entered the conversation directly, the carefully maintained facade of professional composure showing increasing strain. "Financial interpretations often differ during marital transitions," he attempted, though the deflection sounded increasingly desperate even to my ears. "Interpretations may differ," I acknowledged. "Documentation typically doesn't." I opened my portfolio and removed the first set of materials I had prepared. Transaction records showing the precise timestamps of the transfers correlated against my board meeting schedule. These records establish both the timing alignment and the absence of any prior communication regarding the intended transfers. Morrison examined the documentation with the practiced assessment of someone accustomed to evaluating financial evidence. "The correlation appears definitive," he observed. "Transactions executed precisely during scheduled board obligations, with no prior notification or subsequent acknowledgement. The factual foundation had been established without emotional accusations or personal recriminations, exactly the professional approach I had determined would most effectively address the unauthorized transfers." Nathan's options for continued narrative management were rapidly diminishing as documented evidence replaced subjective characterizations. "Business formation often requires decisive action," Nathan attempted, pivoting to a different justification approach. "The opportunity to secure our agency location and client relationships required immediate capital deployment. Opportunity doesn't override authorization requirements for joint assets," I countered, maintaining the same measured tone that had characterized my contributions. "Particularly when those assets represent 12 years of shared financial planning rather than individual resources." Melanie, perhaps recognizing the deteriorating position, attempted another intervention. "Perhaps we've reached a point where constructive discussion of resolution options would be more productive than continued debate about past actions. What specific outcome would address these concerns while allowing our client relationships to continue developing?" The pivot to resolution represented smart negotiation strategy, moving from increasingly indefensible positions to practical next steps. It also aligned with my own strategic objectives, focusing on accountability and recovery rather than punitive measures that might damage legitimate business prospects. "Resolution would require 3 essential elements," I stated, deliberately echoing the framework I had outlined to Morrison during our earlier conversation. "First, proper financial accounting and recovery regarding the unauthorized transfers. Second, appropriate disclosure to affected parties regarding the actual funding circumstances. Third, structured arrangements that allow legitimate business activities to continue without being compromised by the foundational financial impropriety." Nathan studied me with new wariness, perhaps recognizing that my approach reflected not emotional reaction, but strategic calculation, focusing on structural accountability rather than personal recrimination. "That framework seems reasonable. In principle," Morrison commented, creating external validation for the approach. though implementation specifics would require careful structuring to address both the unauthorized transfers and the ongoing business viability. The conversation had reached precisely the inflection point I had anticipated in my overnight strategic planning, moving from establishing factual accountability to constructing appropriate resolution mechanisms. The direct confrontation approach Morrison had suggested was proving more effective than I had initially anticipated, creating immediate accountability without descending into unproductive emotional exchanges. Perhaps the most constructive next step would be establishing a clear accounting of how the transferred funds have been deployed, I suggested, maintaining focus on financial resolution rather than personal grievances. Understanding the current distribution across business activities would facilitate appropriate recovery mechanisms while minimizing disruption to legitimate operations. Nathan's expression shifted through a series of micro-adjustments as he processed my suggestion for a detailed accounting of the deployed funds. The initial defensive tension gave way to calculating assessment, followed by the measured neutrality he typically adopted during challenging negotiations. His eventual response maintained professional composure, though the subtle tightening around his eyes betrayed the strain beneath his controlled exterior. A comprehensive financial review seems premature without establishing appropriate parameters, he countered, his tone suggesting reasonable business caution rather than evasion. Operational deployment involves complex allocation across multiple business functions. Extracting specific tranches would require careful analysis of contractual obligations and operational dependencies. The response represented classic deflection strategy, acknowledging the general concept while introducing procedural complexities to delay concrete action. It was an approach I had observed throughout his career when faced with accountability situations, using operational intricacies to obscure straightforward financial questions. Parameters seem reasonably established by the documentation already presented, Morrison observed, his pragmatic business perspective cutting through the attempted complication. The funds in question have been clearly identified by amount, source, and transfer timing. The only remaining question involves their current distribution across business activities. Melanie, perhaps recognizing that Nathan's deflection approach was proving ineffective with Morrison's direct style, attempted a more constructive intervention. "We certainly understand the need for appropriate financial transparency," she offered, her tone suggesting reasonable accommodation rather than reluctant compliance. "Our accounting systems could generate deployment summaries across major expenditure categories within a reasonable time frame." "How reasonable?" Morrison inquired, maintaining focus on practical next steps rather than conceptual agreements. "By end of business today," Melanie suggested, glancing at Nathan for confirmation. "Comprehensive financial transparency represents the foundation for any potential resolution," I noted, maintaining my focus on structural accountability rather than punitive measures, including both deployed expenditures and committed obligations against these resources. Nathan's expression suggested he recognized the strategic positioning underway, the progressive establishment of accountability mechanisms that would inevitably lead to financial recovery requirements. His next move revealed his shifting approach from deflection to negotiation. Financial transparency would need to be matched with reasonable recovery arrangements, he suggested. Any resolution framework would require balanced consideration of both accountability and operational continuity. The pivot represented calculated acceptance of the inevitable accountability while attempting to establish favorable terms for the resolution phase, a more sophisticated negotiation approach than his initial deflection attempts. Balanced resolution certainly requires consideration of multiple stakeholders, I acknowledged, recognizing the constructive shift in approach while maintaining my position. However, the unauthorized nature of the initial transfers establishes clear parameters regarding proper recovery requirements. Morrison, whose extensive business experience likely included numerous similar situations involving disputed resources, offered a pragmatic assessment. In my experience, mediating complex financial disputes, balanced resolution typically requires three essential components: full accounting transparency, appropriate recovery mechanics, and structured implementation timelines that minimize operational disruption. His framework effectively validated my approach while introducing implementation sequencing that addressed Nathan and Melanie's operational concerns. The mark of experienced negotiation that identified mutual interests within opposing positions. That approach seems reasonable, I confirmed, recognizing the value of Morrison's external validation in establishing constructive resolution parameters. Melanie nodded, her expression suggesting professional relief at the emerging structure. We can provide complete deployment accounting by 5 p.m. today, including both executed expenditures and committed obligations. Nathan, perhaps recognizing that direct opposition would prove counterproductive given Morrison's involvement, adjusted his approach to focus on implementation details rather than foundational accountability. Operational continuity would require careful structuring of any recovery arrangements, particularly regarding client relationships and talent retention. Operational considerations remain secondary to proper financial accountability, Morrison observed, his tone suggesting established business principle rather than negotiating position. Though implementation can certainly be structured to minimize unnecessary disruption once proper accounting and recovery parameters are established. The conversation had effectively transitioned from establishing accountability to negotiating resolution mechanics, precisely the progression I had anticipated in my strategic planning. Nathan and Melanie had moved from deflection to acceptance, focusing now on shaping favorable implementation rather than avoiding fundamental accountability. Beyond financial accounting, appropriate disclosure represents an essential component of proper resolution, I noted, introducing the second element of my resolution framework, particularly regarding representations made to investors, clients, and employees about the agency's capitalization structure. This aspect potentially represented the most significant pressure point in our negotiation, addressing not merely the financial recovery, but the professional narratives Nathan and Melanie had constructed around their agency launch. Their expressions confirmed my assessment, suggesting particular sensitivity to this dimension of accountability. Disclosure protocols in early-stage ventures typically evolve as operational structures mature, Nathan attempted, reverting briefly to his earlier deflection approach. Initial representations focus on operational capabilities rather than precise capital sourcing mechanics. Transparency isn't evolutionary, Morrison countered, his expression suggesting limited patience for continued narrative management, particularly regarding disputed funding sources that create potential liability for associated stakeholders. The reference to liability clearly registered with both Nathan and Melanie, their exchanged glance revealing awareness of the broader implications beyond mere financial recovery. Morrison's position as a prominent investor created significant leverage regarding disclosure requirements. His reputation and financial interests demanded proper transparency regardless of their preferences. We recognize the importance of appropriate stakeholder communication, Melanie acknowledged, her response suggesting reluctant acceptance rather than enthusiastic embrace of disclosure requirements, though messaging would need careful structuring to maintain client confidence and team stability. Transparent disclosure need not undermine legitimate business relationships, I observed, maintaining focus on constructive resolution rather than punitive measures. Properly structured communication can address accountability requirements while supporting operational continuity for activities not directly compromised by the funding situation. This approach represented my carefully considered balance between accountability and pragmatism, acknowledging legitimate business interests while maintaining firm requirements regarding proper disclosure. The strategic objective remained addressing the unauthorized transfers through established accountability mechanisms rather than inflicting maximum damage on their business prospects. Nathan studied me with evident reassessment, perhaps recognizing that my approach reflected strategic calculation rather than vindictive retaliation. The measured response seemed to contrast with whatever reaction he had anticipated to his unauthorized actions, professional accountability rather than emotional escalation. Implementation sequencing becomes critically important in disclosure situations, he noted, his tone suggesting practical business consideration rather than continued evasion. Premature or improperly structured communication could create unnecessary disruption to client relationships and team stability. Sequencing certainly warrants careful consideration, Morrison agreed, though his expression remained focused on substance rather than timing. However, my investment position requires immediate clarity regarding the actual capitalization structure, regardless of broader disclosure timelines. The statement effectively established Morrison's priority, addressing his specific investment exposure before broader resolution parameters. His position represented natural business protection, rather than personal involvement in our dispute, though it created valuable leverage for establishing appropriate accountability. Complete financial transparency with you seems entirely appropriate, given your investment position, Melanie acknowledged, her response indicating recognition of Morrison's leverage in the situation. We can provide comprehensive documentation regarding our capitalization structure, alongside the deployment accounting by 5 p.m. today. The commitment represented significant progress in establishing accountability mechanisms, moving from conceptual discussion to concrete deliverables with specific timelines. Nathan's expression suggested resigned acceptance of this progression, though his next comment attempted to establish boundaries around the resolution process. Financial transparency and appropriate investor disclosure represent reasonable initial steps, he stated. Emphasis on initial, suggesting attempt to limit the scope of immediate accountability. Further resolution elements would require more extensive negotiation regarding implementation mechanics and operational considerations. The attempt to partition the resolution process reflected standard negotiation strategy, acknowledging unavoidable elements while attempting to delay or limit more challenging components. Morrison's response indicated limited patience for this approach. Comprehensive resolution requires addressing all three elements Ms. Harrington identified, he stated, his tone suggesting established business principle rather than negotiable position. Financial accounting, appropriate disclosure, and structured arrangements for ongoing operations. Each component remains essential for proper resolution of the situation. His validation of my framework effectively countered Nathan's attempt to segment the process, establishing the integrated nature of proper accountability, rather than allowing selective compliance. The dynamics had shifted significantly from the verification meeting Nathan and Melanie had anticipated. Morrison's involvement, transforming what might have been a bilateral dispute into a multi-stakeholder accountability situation, requiring comprehensive resolution. We certainly understand the interconnected nature of these elements, Melanie acknowledged, recognizing the futility of continued resistance to the established framework. Our focus remains constructive resolution that addresses accountability, requirements while supporting legitimate business continuity. The statement represented effective pivot to resolution positioning, accepting the inevitable accountability while attempting to shape implementation in ways that protected their core business interests. It reflected sophisticated negotiation approach, moving from resistance to constructive engagement within established parameters. Constructive resolution requires balanced consideration of all stakeholder interests, I agreed, maintaining my focus on accountability mechanisms rather than punitive measures, including appropriate recovery of unauthorized transfers, transparent disclosure to affected parties, and structured arrangements that allow legitimate business activities to continue once proper accountability has been established. This restatement of my resolution framework, now validated by Morrison's business perspective, created clear parameters for the next phase of our negotiation. Nathan and Melanie had effectively accepted the accountability requirements, their focus now shifting to implementation details that might protect their core business interests within these parameters. Perhaps the most productive next step would be establishing the detailed financial accounting we've discussed, Morrison suggested, moving toward concrete action rather than continued negotiation of principles. Once we have comprehensive understanding of how these funds have been deployed, we can structure appropriate resolution mechanisms that address both accountability requirements and operational considerations. The approach aligned perfectly with my strategic objectives, establishing factual accountability through detailed documentation before negotiating specific recovery mechanisms. It prevented premature concessions while creating clear foundation for subsequent resolution discussions. We'll have complete deployment accounting and capitalization documentation delivered to both of you by 5 p.m. today, Melanie confirmed, her tone suggesting professional acceptance of these requirements despite the obvious tension in her posture. In the interim, Morrison continued, I'll need to place certain aspects of our investment relationship on temporary hold pending resolution of these transparency questions. Specifically, my planned announcement regarding strategic partnership between Morrison Development and Westbrook and Harrington Creative will be deferred until we've established proper accountability regarding your capitalization structure. This development represented significant business consequence beyond mere documentation requirements, affecting their market positioning and client acquisition capabilities rather than simply internal operations. Nathan's expression revealed the impact of this announcement, the careful composure briefly giving way to genuine concern before being reestablished. We understand your position, he acknowledged, his tone suggesting professional acceptance despite evident disappointment. Though we hope to address these transparency questions quickly enough to minimize unnecessary disruption to our strategic relationship. Appropriate resolution typically proceeds at the pace of proper accountability, Morrison observed, his expression suggesting established business principle rather than negotiable timeline. Transparency accelerates resolution, while continued management of narratives inevitably extends the process. The statement effectively established the direct relationship between their forthcoming cooperation and the potential timeline for resolution, creating natural incentive for comprehensive transparency rather than continued selective disclosure or narrative management. As the meeting concluded with these established parameters and commitments, I maintained my professional composure while internally acknowledging the significant progress achieved. What had begun as unauthorized transfers during my board meeting had evolved into structured accountability mechanisms with concrete deliverables and timeline commitments. The path forward remained complex, requiring careful navigation of financial, recovery, appropriate disclosure, and operational arrangements. But the foundation had been established, not through emotional confrontation, but through the same disciplined financial approaches that had characterized my professional career. As we departed the conference room, Morrison's parting statement to Nathan and Melanie created final clarity regarding expectations. I'll anticipate your comprehensive documentation by 5 p.m. The nature of that documentation will determine our next steps regarding both investment relationship and potential further accountability requirements. The walk from Westbrook and Harrington's offices to Morrison's waiting car proceeded in professional silence, both of us processing the meeting's outcomes and implications. Only when we were sealed in the privacy of his vehicle did Morrison speak. Remarkably composed, he observed. Most individuals would approach such situations with considerably more emotional response. Emotional responses rarely yield optimal financial outcomes, I replied, particularly when multiple stakeholders are involved. Morrison nodded thoughtfully. Your strategic approach creates potential for resolution that might not otherwise exist. Their accountability seems inevitable, but your focus on structured mechanisms rather than punitive measures offers constructive pathways forward. His assessment validated my strategic approach, addressing the unauthorized transfers through established accountability mechanisms rather than emotional retaliation. The meeting had established both the factual foundation regarding the unauthorized transfers and concrete next steps for resolution, creating momentum toward appropriate accountability without unnecessary disruption to legitimate business activities. "What are your plans while awaiting their financial documentation?" Morrison inquired as the car moved through midday traffic. "I have a scheduled meeting at Riverside Park regarding additional documentation," I replied, having decided to pursue the anonymous source despite the significant progress already achieved. Complete information would strengthen my negotiating position regardless of how forthcoming Nathan and Melanie proved in their 5 p.m. submission. "Would you like me to arrange for one of my security team to accompany you?" Morrison offered. Anonymous contacts sometimes warrant precautionary measures. The offer reflected both professional courtesy and practical business caution, Morrison recognizing potential vulnerabilities in the developing situation. His perspective remained primarily focused on investment protection rather than personal involvement, but the alignment of our interests created natural partnership in the resolution process. "Thank you, but I've arranged appropriate precautions," I assured him, having instructed Diana to monitor my location and establish check-in protocols during the anonymous meeting. As Morrison's car approached Meridian Tower, our conversation concluded with straightforward next steps. We would independently review the financial documentation Nathan and Melanie provided, then confer regarding appropriate resolution mechanisms based on the comprehensive accounting of how the transferred funds had been deployed. "Financial integrity matters in investment relationships," Morrison noted as we parted. "Accountability need not destroy legitimate business potential, but it must precede further development. Your approach creates space for that balanced resolution." The observation captured precisely the equilibrium I had been working to establish, addressing the unauthorized transfers while maintaining professional standards that separated personal breach from business viability. The framework reflected not vindictiveness, but appropriate financial accountability applied with the same discipline that had built my career. Riverside Park stretched along the eastern edge of the city, providing refuge of greenery amid urban development. The meeting location, a bench near the distinctive Japanese maple, offered both visibility for safety and sufficient privacy for confidential conversation. As I approached at precisely 9:15 a.m., I observed a solitary figure already seated there, a woman in her early 30s wearing business casual attire that suggested financial sector employment rather than creative agency background. "Ms. Harrington," she greeted me without rising. "Thank you for coming despite your eventful morning." The reference to my meeting with Nathan and Melanie confirmed my suspicion that this was someone with inside knowledge of the developing situation, not merely an observer, but potentially an active participant in the financial mechanisms surrounding the unauthorized transfers. "You appear to have information advantage regarding my schedule," I noted, taking a seat beside her while maintaining professional distance. "Perhaps introductions would establish appropriate context for our conversation." "Sarah Winters," she replied. "Senior Transaction Specialist at First Capital Bank, Private Client Division. Until yesterday, I handled account services for Melanie Westbrook." The introduction explained her access to the financial information she had referenced in her text messages, direct professional involvement in the banking operations that had facilitated the unauthorized transfers. Her use of "until yesterday" suggested recent changes in that professional relationship, potentially indicating concerns about the transactions themselves. "Your messages referenced documentation regarding the transfers from my joint account," I prompted, maintaining professional focus rather than pursuing peripheral details. Sarah nodded, removing a slim folder from her messenger bag. "3 days ago, I processed a series of transfers from your joint account with Nathan Harrington to a newly established account under Melanie Westbrook's name. The timing and structure of these transfers raised several compliance concerns that were overridden through irregular authorization protocols." She opened the folder, revealing transaction records with highlighted sections indicating approval, timestamps, and authorization codes. These transfers were initially flagged by our automated compliance system due to both the amount and the destination parameters. Standard protocol would require additional verification before processing. Yet they proceeded without such verification, I observed, examining the documentation that confirmed what I had already discovered through my own investigation. Yes, through direct intervention by Thomas Carlson, head of private banking, at Geneva Trust and former supervisor to Melanie Westbrook during her time at Bradford Financial. Sarah's expression reflected professional concern rather than personal involvement. The override circumvented standard verification protocols that would typically apply to transactions of this nature and amount. The information aligned with Diana's research findings regarding Melanie's banking connections, confirming not merely opportunistic exploitation, but carefully orchestrated financial extraction, utilizing established professional relationships to optimize execution. More concerning is this, Sarah continued, turning to the next document, a printed email exchange between Melanie and Thomas Carlson discussing the planned transfers. The correspondence explicitly referenced timing alignment with my board meeting schedule, confirming deliberate coordination rather than coincidental timing. The transfer execution was specifically structured to occur during your board presentation, with explicit acknowledgement that this timing would prevent immediate detection or intervention, Sarah explained. This level of calculated timing raises significant questions regarding proper authorization and disclosure. The documentation provided definitive confirmation of what I had already suspected: deliberate coordination to execute the transfers during my professional obligations, specifically to prevent immediate awareness or response. The evidence transformed what might have been characterized as opportunistic financial action into calculated extraction with documented intent to circumvent normal authorization protocols. "Why are you sharing this information with me?" I asked, maintaining professional caution despite the apparent alignment with my interests. Anonymous sources warranted verification regardless of how compelling their documentation appeared. "Professional integrity," Sarah replied without hesitation. "Banking operations require proper authorization protocols regardless of personal relationships between clients. When I identified these irregular patterns and raised compliance concerns, I was instructed to process the transactions without standard verification. Yesterday, I submitted formal documentation to our compliance department regarding these irregularities, which resulted in my reassignment to different client accounts." Her explanation suggested professional ethics rather than personal vendetta. Concern about irregular financial operations rather than involvement in the relationship dynamics between Nathan, Melanie, and me. The motivation aligned with what Thomas Brennan had expressed during our late-night discussion. Financial professionals recognizing potential impropriety in transaction patterns, regardless of personal connections to the situation. These records appear to provide definitive confirmation regarding both the transfer mechanics and the deliberate timing alignment, I observed, reviewing the comprehensive documentation she had provided. "Have you shared this information with anyone else?" "Only through appropriate compliance channels within First Capital," Sarah confirmed, "though similar documentation has likely reached Morrison Development through their standard due diligence protocols when evaluating investment relationships. Financial institutions maintain monitoring arrangements that would identify transaction patterns matching certain risk parameters." The information explained how Morrison had received verification concerns from multiple sources, standard financial monitoring systems identifying the same irregular patterns that had prompted Sarah's compliance questions. The situation reflected natural protective mechanisms within financial systems rather than coordinated efforts against Nathan and Melanie's venture. This documentation provides valuable context for the resolution process already underway, I acknowledged, carefully securing the materials in my portfolio. Though I'm curious why you chose direct contact rather than allowing the compliance mechanisms to proceed through established channels. Sarah's expression suggested professional consideration rather than emotional involvement. Banking compliance processes typically focus on institutional risk mitigation rather than client protection. Direct disclosure to affected parties often produces more balanced outcomes than regulatory intervention alone. Her perspective aligned with Eleanor Hargrove's earlier advice regarding strategic leverage points, addressing unauthorized transfers through negotiated resolution rather than formal regulatory proceedings whenever possible. The approach reflected financial industry best practices rather than personal involvement in the underlying situation. "I appreciate your professional integrity in bringing this information forward," I said as our meeting concluded. "The documentation will certainly inform appropriate resolution of this situation." As Sarah departed in one direction and I in another, I reflected on how this additional intelligence would influence the developing accountability process. The documented intent to circumvent normal authorization protocols transformed what might have been characterized as aggressive financial management during divorce into deliberate circumvention of proper authorization processes, a distinction with significant implications for both recovery requirements and potential disclosure obligations. The remainder of the day unfolded with the disciplined focus that had characterized my approach throughout this situation. I returned to Meridian Tower, where Diana had assembled comprehensive research on Melanie's banking connections and professional history. I consulted with Eleanor Hargrove regarding appropriate recovery mechanisms, given the documentation of deliberate timing and override of standard verification protocols. I prepared structured analysis of potential resolution frameworks that would address the unauthorized transfers while allowing legitimate business activities to continue under appropriate arrangements. At precisely 5:03 p.m., my secure terminal signaled an incoming document package from Westbrook and Harrington Creative, the promised financial accounting and capitalization documentation. The materials arrived simultaneously at Morrison's office, his assistant confirming receipt and immediate review by their financial team. The documentation revealed exactly what I had anticipated: rapid deployment of the transferred funds across multiple business establishment activities, office lease security deposits, technology infrastructure investments, creative team hiring, advances, and launch event expenditures. The comprehensive accounting confirmed both the unauthorized nature of the transfers and the subsequent entanglement of these funds with legitimate business operations now involving multiple additional stakeholders. Most revealing was the capitalization structure documentation, which showed that beyond the unauthorized transfers, Nathan and Melanie had minimal additional resources supporting their venture. The transferred funds represented over 90% of their actual capitalization, with the remaining portion consisting primarily of Nathan's personal savings. The series of $9,500 withdrawals I had identified during my earlier investigation. The financial reality contrasted sharply with the narrative they had presented at their launch event. Not innovative financial structuring, but straightforward appropriation of joint marital assets without proper authorization or disclosure. The documentation transformed what might have been disputed characterization into factual confirmation, creating definitive foundation for the resolution mechanisms I had been developing. At 6:30 p.m., Morrison's call arrived, his financial team having completed their initial assessment of the provided documentation. "The capitalization structure is considerably more problematic than initially indicated," he noted without preamble. "Their actual funding consists almost exclusively of the transferred amounts from your joint account, with minimal additional resources supporting their operational commitments." "The documentation aligns with my analysis," I confirmed, creating significant questions regarding both recovery requirements and ongoing operational viability. "Indeed," Morrison agreed, "though the deployment patterns suggest potential for structured resolution that addresses accountability without unnecessarily dismantling legitimate business functions. Several key clients, including Pinnacle Developments, have established relationships that could potentially continue under appropriately restructured arrangements. His assessment aligned with my own strategic thinking, focusing on accountability and recovery, while preserving legitimate business potential that now extended beyond Nathan and Melanie to include clients, employees, and operational partners. The approach reflected disciplined financial thinking rather than punitive instinct, addressing unauthorized actions while minimizing collateral damage to uninvolved stakeholders. I've scheduled a resolution meeting for tomorrow morning at 9 a.m., Morrison continued. My office rather than their agency space, neutral territory with appropriate administrative support for documenting whatever arrangements emerge from our discussion. The timeline accelerated resolution more rapidly than I had initially anticipated, though the comprehensive documentation provided by Nathan and Melanie had established sufficient factual foundation for structured negotiations. Their apparent cooperation in providing detailed financial accounting suggested recognition that resolution had become inevitable. Their focus now on shaping implementation rather than avoiding accountability. I'll be prepared with appropriate resolution frameworks, I confirmed, having already developed several potential approaches based on different deployment scenarios. The actual documentation allowed me to refine these models, creating specific recovery mechanisms aligned with how the funds had been utilized across various business activities. Morrison's office occupied the top floor of his company's headquarters building, a sophisticated space that projected established success rather than the aspirational aesthetic of Westbrook and Harrington's new agency. The conference room where we gathered the following morning featured subtle displays of Morrison's accomplishments, architectural models of significant developments, awards for business innovation, photographs with prominent business and civic leaders, all suggesting the substantial influence he wielded in contrast to Nathan and Melanie's vulnerable position. They arrived precisely at 9 a.m., their expressions suggesting resignation rather than continued resistance. The comprehensive documentation they had provided had effectively eliminated further narrative management options. Factual accountability had been established, leaving only resolution mechanics to be negotiated. Thank you for the detailed financial accounting provided yesterday, Morrison began once introductions and seating arrangements had been established. The documentation provides clear foundation for addressing the capitalization questions we discussed during our verification meeting. Nathan nodded, his expression suggesting professional acceptance of the inevitable accountability. We recognize the importance of transparent financial disclosure, particularly regarding investment relationships and client engagements. The acknowledgement represented significant shift from his initial deflection attempts, acceptance of accountability rather than continued narrative management. Whether motivated by strategic assessment or simple recognition of his limited options, the approach created potential for constructive resolution rather than protracted conflict. Based on the provided documentation, several key points warrant specific attention, Morrison continued, referencing materials prepared by his financial team. First, the capitalization structure relies almost exclusively on funds transferred from the joint account shared by Mr. Harrington and Ms. Harrington, with these transfers executed during Ms. Harrington's board meeting without prior notification or subsequent acknowledgement. The clinical precision of Morrison's statement established factual accountability without requiring emotional characterization, professional assessment, rather than accusatory framing. His approach maintained focus on financial mechanics rather than relationship dynamics, creating appropriate context for resolution discussions. Second, these funds have been deployed across multiple business establishment activities, creating operational entanglements that extend beyond the original unauthorized transfers to include client relationships, employee commitments, and operational partnerships. This deployment pattern creates both recovery challenges and operational considerations that warrant structured resolution rather than simple reversal. His framework effectively balanced accountability requirements with practical implementation considerations, acknowledging the complexity created by how the funds had been utilized, rather than suggesting simplistic solutions that might damage legitimate business functions. Finally, the documentation confirms absence of proper disclosure regarding these capitalization issues during our investment negotiations, creating significant questions about appropriate transparency with other stakeholders, including clients, employees, and operational partners. This final point addressed the broader implications beyond mere financial recovery, establishing the need for appropriate disclosure to affected parties rather than continued misrepresentation regarding the agency's funding sources and potential vulnerabilities. These considerations collectively suggest need for comprehensive resolution framework that addresses both proper financial recovery and appropriate operational restructuring, Morrison concluded, establishing the parameters for our negotiation. Rather than inviting further debate about established facts, Nathan and Melanie exchanged glances, their expressions suggesting recognition that resistance had become futile given the comprehensive documentation they themselves had provided. Melanie spoke first, her tone suggesting professional pragmatism, rather than continued evasion. "We recognize the need for appropriate resolution regarding these capitalization issues," she acknowledged. "Our priority involves addressing accountability requirements while preserving the legitimate business potential we've established with clients and creative team members." The position aligned with what I had anticipated: acceptance of inevitable, accountability while attempting to preserve core business functions that extended beyond the unauthorized transfers themselves. It represented reasonable negotiation approach within the established factual parameters, rather than continued attempt to avoid consequences entirely. Constructive resolution requires balancing multiple legitimate interests, I noted, speaking for the first time since introductory exchanges, including appropriate recovery of unauthorized transfers, transparent disclosure to affected parties, and structured arrangements that allow legitimate business activities to continue once proper accountability has been established. My restatement of the resolution framework I had consistently maintained throughout this process created continuity rather than introducing new demands or punitive measures. The approach focused on accountability mechanisms rather than emotional satisfaction, addressing the unauthorized transfers through established financial protocols rather than relationship dynamics. Based on the comprehensive documentation provided, I've prepared structured resolution proposal that addresses each of these elements while balancing the various stakeholder interests involved, I continued, distributing copies of the framework I had refined based on their financial accounting. The proposal contained 3 integrated components: financial recovery mechanisms proportionate to the unauthorized transfers, disclosure requirements appropriate to different stakeholder categories, and operational restructuring that would allow legitimate business functions to continue under modified arrangements. The financial recovery component established clear accountability for the unauthorized transfers without requiring immediate liquidation of essential business infrastructure, creating staged recovery aligned with operational capacity rather than punitive extraction that might unnecessarily damage legitimate business potential. The disclosure requirements established appropriate transparency obligations tailored to different stakeholder relationships, comprehensive disclosure to investment partners like Morrison, appropriate financial stability communication with clients, and relevant continuity information for employees and operational partners. The operational restructuring created framework for continued business functions under modified ownership arrangements, establishing appropriate equity compensation for the unauthorized transfers while allowing legitimate creative activities to continue serving established client relationships. Nathan studied the proposal with evident surprise, perhaps having anticipated more punitive approach given the circumstances of the unauthorized transfers. His expression suggested reassessment of my intentions, recognition that my objective involved appropriate accountability rather than vindictive destruction of their business potential. This framework represents remarkably balanced approach to complex situation, Morrison observed, his financial team having reviewed the proposal alongside Nathan and Melanie. It establishes clear accountability for the unauthorized transfers, while creating practical implementation mechanics that recognize operational realities. His validation provided external confirmation of the proposal's reasonableness, professional assessment from experienced business negotiator, rather than merely my perspective as directly affected party. The approach created natural pressure toward acceptance through implicit comparison to potentially more severe alternatives that might emerge through formal legal proceedings. The financial recovery components appear proportionate to the transferred amounts, Melanie acknowledged, her analytical assessment reflecting professional consideration rather than emotional response. Though the implementation timeline would require careful coordination with operational cash flow projections to ensure business continuity. Timeline flexibility remains appropriate within established accountability parameters, I confirmed, having intentionally structured the recovery mechanics to allow reasonable implementation sequencing rather than imposing impossible immediate requirements. Provided proper documentation and security mechanisms establish appropriate protections against further unauthorized actions. The negotiation proceeded with remarkable efficiency given the situation's complexity, professional discussion of implementation mechanics rather than emotional debate about established facts. Nathan and Melanie proposed reasonable modifications to certain timeline elements while accepting the fundamental accountability requirements. Morrison's team suggested practical documentation approaches for the modified ownership structure. My contributions maintained focus on appropriate recovery mechanisms while allowing flexible implementation within established parameters. By early afternoon, we had established comprehensive resolution framework incorporating essential elements from my initial proposal with reasonable implementation refinements suggested during our negotiation. The modified arrangement established appropriate accountability for the unauthorized transfers while creating practical pathway for the agency's legitimate business functions to continue serving established client relationships under restructured ownership arrangements. The final framework included 3 integrated components, each addressing essential aspect of appropriate resolution. First, financial recovery mechanisms established proportionate accountability for the unauthorized transfers. Structured equity, conversion that transformed the funds from unauthorized extraction to documented investment with appropriate ownership implications. The arrangement created proper financial accounting without requiring immediate liquidation that might unnecessarily damage legitimate business operations. Second, disclosure protocols established appropriate transparency with affected stakeholders. Comprehensive documentation with Morrison regarding the modified investment structure. Appropriate financial stability communication with clients like Pinnacle Developments. And relevant continuity information for employees and operational partners. Third, operational restructuring created modified ownership arrangement that acknowledged my financial contribution through the unauthorized transfers, establishing appropriate equity position and oversight mechanisms while allowing the creative functions to continue serving established client relationships under professional management structure. The resolution represented balanced approach to complex situation, establishing clear accountability for the unauthorized transfers while creating practical implementation mechanics that recognized operational realities. It reflected professional, financial thinking rather than emotional reaction, addressing improper actions through established accountability mechanisms without unnecessarily damaging legitimate business potential that now extended beyond Nathan and Melanie to include clients, employees, and operational partners. As we concluded the formal documentation of these arrangements, Morrison offered observation that captured the essence of our resolution. Financial integrity requires appropriate accountability for unauthorized actions, but effective resolution balances that accountability with practical implementation that serves legitimate business interests. This framework accomplishes both objectives, establishing clear consequences for improper financial conduct while creating constructive pathway forward for the legitimate business functions that have been established. The assessment validated the disciplined approach I had maintained throughout this situation, addressing the unauthorized transfers through established accountability mechanisms rather than emotional retaliation. The resolution reflected not Vindictiveness but appropriate financial protocols applied with the same professionalism that had built my career. 3 months later, I sat across from Diana in my office, reviewing the quarterly performance reports from what was now officially called Westbrook and Harrington Creative Partners, the restructured agency operating under the modified ownership arrangements established during our resolution negotiations. The partners addition to the name reflected both the equity restructuring and the more transparent operational model that had emerged from the accountability process. Client retention has remained stable despite the ownership transition, Diana noted, highlighting relevant sections of the performance analysis, particularly the Pinnacle Developments relationship, which has actually expanded under the new arrangement. The operational outcome validated the balanced resolution approach, maintaining legitimate business functions while establishing appropriate accountability for the unauthorized transfers. The modified ownership structure had transformed the funds from unauthorized extraction to documented investment with proper governance mechanisms and transparent financial reporting. Morrison's continued involvement appears to have stabilized their market position, I observed, noting his strategic guidance evident in their business development approach. Though his oversight requirements have certainly constrained Nathan and Melanie's autonomy compared to their original vision. Diana nodded, her professional assessment reflecting objective analysis rather than emotional satisfaction. The accountability mechanisms have created more disciplined operational structure than typically exists in creative startups. The reporting requirements and governance protocols provide stability that benefits both client relationships and talent retention. The observation captured the constructive aspects of our resolution beyond mere financial recovery, establishing appropriate accountability mechanisms that actually improved operational stability rather than simply imposing punitive restrictions. The approach had transformed unauthorized transfers into structured investment with proper governance, addressing the improper actions while preserving legitimate business potential. And the financial performance? I inquired, turning to the quarterly revenue analysis that would determine the first scheduled distribution under our equity arrangement. Exceeding initial projections by approximately 12%, Diana confirmed. The structured accountability appears to have created more disciplined approach to business development and operational management than their original launch strategy anticipated. The financial results validated Morrison's assessment during our resolution negotiations that proper accountability could potentially strengthen business performance rather than merely imposing consequences for unauthorized actions. The disciplined structure established through our resolution had created operational stability that benefited all stakeholders rather than simply addressing the financial breach. As I signed the quarterly certification documents that maintained appropriate oversight without unnecessary operational interference, I reflected on the path that had led to this outcome. What had begun as devastating discovery during my board presentation had evolved through strategic resolution into structured arrangement that established appropriate accountability while preserving legitimate business potential. The resolution reflected not emotional vindication, but professional financial principles, addressing unauthorized actions through established accountability mechanisms rather than punitive measures that might have satisfied immediate emotional response, but damaged legitimate business functions affecting multiple stakeholders beyond Nathan and Melanie themselves. Most significantly, the process had reinforced my recognition that professional principles applied with disciplined focus yielded superior outcomes to emotional reactions in both corporate leadership and personal financial management. The unauthorized transfers had been addressed through structured accountability rather than escalated conflict, creating resolution that balanced appropriate consequences with practical implementation. As Diana departed with the signed certification documents, I turned toward the panoramic windows of my office, observing the city skyline that represented both my professional domain and the business community that had witnessed this entire situation unfold. Nathan had calculated that I would be too professionally constrained, too emotionally devastated, or too concerned with appearances to respond effectively to his actions during my board meeting. What he had failed to recognize throughout our marriage and during his calculated extraction was that my professional discipline represented strength rather than limitation. The same financial expertise that had built my career had ultimately established appropriate accountability for his unauthorized actions, creating resolution that reflected financial integrity rather than emotional retaliation. Not revenge, but accountability, delivered not through vindictive destruction, but through the same disciplined financial approaches that governed my professional decisions. The outcome represented not merely personal resolution, but professional validation, confirmation that principled financial practices applied consistently across both corporate leadership and personal financial management yielded superior results to emotional reactions or vindictive impulses. The quarterly distribution notice on my desk, the first financial return from the restructured ownership arrangement, represented tangible evidence of this principled approach. What Nathan had attempted to take through unauthorized extraction during my board meeting had been transformed through disciplined resolution into properly structured investment with appropriate governance and transparent reporting. Not the outcome he had anticipated when transferring our savings during my board presentation, but precisely the accountability that financial integrity required, delivered through professional principles rather than emotional reaction.